I had never worked a night shift before. Not seriously, anyway. Sure, I'd done the occasional late closing at a convenience store back in college. But nothing like this. This gas station sat on the edge of town, right where the road curved into a long stretch of nothing. There were fields on one side, a line of scraggy trees on the other, and the hum of passing cars rarely reached this far. When I pulled up in my old patrol car, the place looked smaller than I imagined. The flickering neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly red light over cracked asphalt. The manager, a thin man with a permanent look of exhaustion, handed me the keys without much of a greeting. He had that same blank, tired stare most people have after years of night work. "Lock up at midnight," he said, shrugging. "Call me if anything weird happens." And that's when I first noticed it. The way he said it, like he was warning me, but also like he had given up trying to prevent whatever he'd seen before. Inside, the store smelled faintly of old coffee and motor oil, a combination I had never liked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, giving off a pale glow that didn't quite reach the corners. I wandered the aisles slowly, trying to settle my nerves. Everything was normal, I told myself. Chips, soda, some candy racks, a stack of newspapers. The cash register gleamed under the harsh lights, and the surveillance monitors hummed softly, showing the empty pumps outside. By the time the first hour passed, a strange unease had begun to creep in. At first, it was just a silence. There were no cars on the pumps, no distant voices. Nothing but the low hum of the refrigeration units. That silence pressed against my ears, making the usual sounds, clicks of the register, the faint buzz of the lights, feel sharper, like they were too loud in the empty store. I tried to shake it off, kept busy straightening shelves and checking the stock, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched lingered at the edge of my mind. Then I heard it, a soft thud, somewhere behind the snack aisle. I froze, holding my breath. It could have been a box falling, I told myself. A loose bag of chips. Maybe. I slowly moved toward the sound, try and keep my footsteps quiet. Nothing, just the empty aisle staring back at me, the fluorescent lights flickering as if unsure whether to stay on. I laughed quietly, a short, bitter sound. "It's fine. You're fine," I whispered to myself. But my stomach nodded with something I couldn't name. Something cold, like a shadow pressing against the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up, prickling. I moved back toward the counter and tried to ignore it. The night wore on, dragging each minute like molasses. I kept checking the surveillance monitors, watching the pumps outside. But there was nothing, yet the feeling didn't leave me. If anything, it got worse. The shadows seemed deeper, near the corners of the store. When I glanced toward them, I thought I saw shapes move just out corner of my eye. Dark shapes, like someone crouched behind the shelves. But whenever I turned, nothing was there. By the second hour, I started hearing more. Not loud noises, just faint whispers. Soft, almost like the wind brushing against the windows. But the trees outside were still. I swear I heard a voice muttering something I couldn't catch, like a name or a warning. It made my skin crawl, the way it brushed against my ears and disappeared the instant I turned to look. I told myself it was just nerves, just the isolation getting to me. I'd read about that before, how being alone at night can play tricks on your mind. But this felt different, real, and the more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the heavier the weight of being watched pressed down on me. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a presence. Something that didn't belong in the store, in the quiet town. Something that had been waiting. I went outside to check the pumps, flashlight in hand. The night was colder than I expected, the wind biting at my cheeks. Nothing moved. No cars, no animals, no shadows. Just the cracked asphalt and the faded paint on the gas pumps. And then I saw it, or rather, I felt it. A flicker at the edge of my vision, just past the pumps. Something standing too still, too dark. I spun the flashlight toward it. Nothing, but the hair on my neck rose, and I could feel my heart hammering. I went back inside, trying to act normal, telling myself it was my imagination. The monitor showed the outside empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting just beyond the light. Every small sound inside the store set me on edge. The beep of the ice machine, the low groan of the ceiling fans, the soft click of a door closing somewhere I couldn't see. I couldn't even focus on tidying up. My hands shook, my thoughts scattered. Around midnight, things got worse. I was counting down the minutes, waiting to lock the doors and leave, when the lights flickered violently. For a brief moment, the store was plunged into darkness, and in that darkness, I felt it close to me. Not a shadow, not a person, just an impossible weight pressing down, a cold presence that made my breath catch in my throat. When the lights flickered back, everything looked normal, too normal, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something move, something watching me from the aisles. The final hour was a blur. Every sound, every flicker of light made me jump. I tried to keep busy, clean the counters, check the shelves again and again. The whispers came and went, soft and low, always at the edge of hearing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps above me, though the gas station only had one floor. I told myself it was just a building settling, but the sound was deliberate, too rhythmic, too measured to be anything natural. When I finally reached the end of my shift, my hands were clammy, my stomach tight with tension. I locked the doors and turned the sign to close. I wanted to leave fast, to get away from the building, but I paused. The silence outside was different from the inside. Too quiet. The world felt empty, like it had been holding its breath, waiting for me to leave so it could shift back into some unknown shape. As I drove away, headlights cutting to the black road, I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror at the gas station. The neon sign buzzed. The store sat empty and still, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had followed me, that the eyes I hadn't been able to see were still there, watching from the darkness behind those flickering fluorescent lights. Even now I can feel it, the weight of that night, the sound of whispers, the flicker in the corner of my vision. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, just nerves. But every time I close my eyes, I see the aisles, the shadows, the flickering light, and I feel those eyes still waiting, still watching, always waiting. I don't know if I'll ever go back. And if I do, I won't be alone in that store again. Not if I can help it. The second night felt heavier than the first. I told myself I was prepared this time, that the unease from last shift was just nerves. I parked in the same spot, the old patrol car crunching over cracked asphalt. The neon sign buzzed the same sickly red glow, but it seemed dimmer tonight, like it was struggling to hold on. I didn't know if it was the light or my imagination, but the whole station felt smaller, tighter, more suffocating. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a low, constant noise that seemed louder in the stillness. I switched on the monitors, watching the pumps outside. Nothing. The aisles looked the same. Chips, candy, magazines neatly stacked. I tried to convince myself that everything was normal, that my mind was playing tricks again. But deep down I felt it, the same weight pressing on me from last night, only stronger. I started my usual rounds, checking shelves and tidying the counter, but it was impossible to focus. The lights flickered once, twice, and each time the store plunged into brief darkness. Just a heartbeat or two each time, but enough for me to sense shapes moving in the corners of my vision. Every flicker made my stomach drop. Every shadow a threat I could name. The security monitors began acting strange about an hour in. Small blurs, almost too fast to catch, flickered across the cameras. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch, a reflection, or a bug, but then I noticed patterns. Something moved against the grain of reality, sliding across aisles without touching the floor, disappearing and reappearing where it shouldn't. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screens, trying to make sense of what I saw. I kept checking the aisles directly, flashlight in hand, but nothing was there. The store looked empty, perfectly still, and yet on the monitors, the shadows moved like living things. Sometimes they lingered, stretched thin and dark across the floor, only to vanish the instant I turned my head. The longer I watched, the more certain I became that I wasn't alone. Not in a human way. Something was in the store, or watching from outside, bending the rules I thought were real. I moved toward the snack aisle, the flashlight beam cutting through the dim corners. The flickering lights made the shadows dance, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. I thought I saw someone crouch behind a shelf, a dark shape hunched unnaturally. But when I swung the flashlight fully toward it, there was nothing. Nothing except the shells, the candy, the quiet hum of the lights. I tried to tell myself I was seeing things, that the isolation was finally getting to me, but the shadows didn't stop. Every flicker of light created shapes that weren't there a moment ago. I swear I saw something lean against the end of an aisle, waiting, and every time I turned, it wasn't there. Yet I could feel its presence, heavy and cold, pressing against my back. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight, knuckles white. I tried to breathe slowly, tried to calm myself, but the air felt thicker, harder to draw in. I checked the monitors again, this time focusing on the storage room. The camera there caught a dark figure slipping behind the door, moving too fast, too fluid to be human. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't look away. The figure vanished just as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the empty storage room in the frame. My chest felt tight, my pulse racing. What had I just seen? I forced myself to move toward the back, toward the storage room. Each step made my stomach twist tighter, each creak of the floorboard echoing too loud in the quiet store. When I reached the door, I hesitated, hand on the handle. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, a shadow I imagined. But as I opened the door, I felt a rush of cold air, and for a second, I could have sworn something was standing just behind me. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing, just the aisle empty and still. The storage room was quiet, colder than the rest of the store. I tried to shake it off, focus on checking the shelves and boxes, making sure everything was in order. But every so often, a flicker of the lights above would cast long, impossible shadows across the floor, shapes that stretched and bent, crouched and slithered like they had a mind of their own. My breath caught in my throat each time, every shadow a reminder that I was not alone. I moved back toward the front of the store, trying to convince myself to stop watching the monitors so closely. But curiosity, or maybe fear, drew me back again and again. Each time, the screen showed shapes that shouldn't exist. One moment the aisle was empty. The next, a figure, tall and thin, just at the edge of the frame, vanished the instant I looked around. My pulse pounded so loudly I thought the shape might hear it, and my hand shook so badly I could barely adjust the zoom on the cameras. By the third hour, the store felt alive in a way that made my stomach churn. The lights flickered more often now, the hum of the fluorescence a constant background scream in my ears. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretched along the walls, and seemed to move against the rhythm of the store. I could swear I saw something leaning around in an aisle, tilting its head as if watching me. I spun around. Nothing, but the feeling of eyes on me didn't leave. It didn't leave for a second, not even a heartbeat. I tried to focus on cleaning the counters, straightening shelves, anything to distract myself, but the flickers were relentless, each one making the shadows longer, darker, more deliberate. I caught myself imagining things that couldn't exist, hands reaching for the shelves, figures sliding along the walls, impossible movements that defied physics. And each time I thought I imagined it, the cameras showed it. Clear, undeniable, yet gone the instant I looked myself. I moved back to the monitors, exhausted, stomach twisted, head pounding. The outside cameras flickered too, catching what looked like someone or something running past pumps. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing. The lot was empty, barren, and silent. I started muttering under my breath, trying to remind myself it was all in my head, trying to ground myself. But the monitors didn't lie. They showed things I couldn't explain, movements that weren't possible, shadows that didn't belong. Around 4 a.m, I realized the feeling had grown worse. Not just unease, not just fear, but a deep, sinking certainty that I was being watched in ways I could not comprehend. Every flicker, every movement, every shadow felt alive. It pressed against me, filled the room, crowded the corners of my mind. I felt small, vulnerable, a tiny human in a space that had grown enormous and alien. I tried to keep busy, wipe down the counters, reorganize some shelves, but it was meaningless. Every time I moved, a shadow shifted, flickered, and warped in ways that shouldn't be possible. I could feel eyes on me, not human eyes, something older, patient, waiting. The cameras recorded it. My own eyes saw glimpses, and yet, whenever I tried to confront it, It vanished, leaving only the lingering, horrible certainty that it was still there. By the end of my shift, I was trembling, hands raw from gripping the flashlight, mind frayed from constant fear. I locked the doors and switched off the lights, but the shadows didn't leave. Even in the quiet, even on the empty road driving home, I could feel them lingering in my peripheral vision, flickering, watching, moving where they shouldn't be. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the store was just old and creaky and my imagination had finally cracked. But deep down, I knew something had followed me, had found me. I still see those shadows in my dreams, stretching and flickering in the dark, bending in impossible ways, waiting for me to return. And I know if I go back, they'll be there, exactly where I left them, watching, always watching. I never wanted to go outside. Not really. But that night, something tugged at me, a whisper at the edge of hearing that I couldn't quite ignore. It was faint at first, a soft, sibilant sound that felt like it had curled itself around the edges of my mind. I froze when I first noticed it, standing behind the counter, chest tight, ears straining. At first, I thought it was the wind, the same empty road sign past the station. But it wasn't. It was a voice. I remember telling myself over and over, it's nothing, just nerves, just the isolation. You've been here long enough for your imagination to start playing tricks. But the voice didn't stop. It started low and close, like someone was right behind me, whispering my name, just under the hum of the fluorescent lights. I spun around, heart hammering, flashlight in hand. Nothing. The store was empty, silent except for the faint flicker of the lights and the occasional buzz of the refrigerator. The whisper started again, softer this time, winding around the shelves, curling through the aisles. They weren't words, not exactly, more like syllables, sounds meant to draw attention, to make you listen, to pull you closer. I could feel my pulse in my temples, each beat hammering through my skull, making it impossible to think clearly. My hands shook, my stomach twisted. But somehow, something inside me told me I had to go. I stepped toward the door, my feet heavy, as if the air itself resisted my movement. The wind outside was still, unusually quiet, and for a moment I paused, gripping the door handle like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Then I heard it clearly, unmistakable this time. My name, whispered low and slow, stretching across the alley behind the station. It was neither male nor female. It had no accent, no age, just a sound meant for me. I opened the door and stepped out. The night hit me cold, sharper than I expected, like the air itself was alive. The alley stretched narrow and dark, lined by the brick walls of the station and the neighboring buildings. Shadows pooled in the corners, deeper than the dim street light could reach. The whisper came again, softer now, drifting over the asphalt like smoke, and I walked toward it. I don't know why I did. Every rational thought screamed at me to run, to lock the doors and forget the night. But I kept moving, drawn by something I couldn't name. The alley was silent, except the sound of my own shoes crunching against gravel. The neon sign from the station cast a weak glow behind me, creating long, stretching shadows that wavered across the brick walls. I noticed footprints in the dirt along the edge of the alley. Small, shallow impressions, like they had been made by bare feet. They were impossible. Human feet didn't move that way, didn't vanish like this. Each step I took, the footprint seemed to shift, vanish, or appear anew. It made my skin crawl, my throat tight with panic I couldn't fully acknowledge. The voice came again, this time closer, almost right at my ear. I froze, pressing my hand against my chest, trying to calm the frantic pounding of my heart. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't threatening. It was patient, waiting, pulling, and I knew somehow that if I turned back, it would vanish, leaving nothing but silence and my own fear. I kept moving toward the deeper shadow at the end of the alley. The footprints multiplied, twisted, some facing toward me, some away, like they didn't follow any logic I could understand. I bent down, flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to examine them. The gravel shifted slightly under my touch, but the prints themselves disappeared. It was as if the ground had never been disturbed at all. I swallowed hard, a lump in my throat that made breathing difficult. The alley seemed longer than it had any right to be. Each step felt like it stretched time, like the air itself resisted my progress. The voice whispered again, winding through the bricks and the shadows, and for the first time, I felt it inside my head, as if it had passed through my ears and wrapped around my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was hallucinating, imagining things that weren't there. But the footprints were real. That part of the world was undeniable, even if it made no sense. A cold wind rose suddenly, curling down the alley, brushing against my neck and making my hair stand on end. I spun the flashlight in every direction, but nothing moved, nothing visible. Yet the sense of being watched intensified, a heavy pressure at the back of my skull, crawling down my spine. The whispers didn't stop. They weren't coming from anywhere and everywhere at once. They were in me now, inside my mind, circling, patient and insistent. I found myself at the far end of the alley. The shadows deeper here, the light from the station barely reaching. The footprints had stopped, ending abruptly at a cracked drain cover. But as I stared, the prints shifted again, tiny toes pressing into the gravel where none had been before. I stumbled back a step, blinking rapidly. My hands shook, flashlight beam wavering, and I could feel a cold sweat run down my spine. I wanted to run, but something, that impossible pull, held me there. The whisper changed, almost a sound I could understand now, though the words were still wrong. It was soft, coaxing, as if it wanted me closer, wanted me to lean in and understand. I pressed my palms on my ears, but it didn't stop. The sound was inside me, threading through my bones, tugging at my thoughts. I tried to shout, to tell it to leave, to tell myself it wasn't real, but my voice caught in my throat. I was frozen in place, a puppet with invisible strings, unable to move or run. A shadow shifted along the alley wall, longer than it should have been, stretching toward me like smoke. I blinked. Nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears, my stomach twisting, my hands trembling violently. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. But the sense of being watched remained, thicker now, more real. I could feel it, just behind the edge of perception, pressing against my skin, against my mind. I forced myself to move, each step deliberate, careful, trembling. The footprints continued to appear and vanish beneath my feet, leading me closer to the center of the alley. I couldn't understand how this could happen. My mind tried to grasp at explanations, rats, animals, shadows, but nothing fit. Nothing could. And the deeper I went, the heavier the air felt, like breathing in a substance too thick, too cold for the night to hold. I reached the center of the alley and stopped, gasping for air, heart racing. The footprints had vanished completely now, leaving only the smooth, undisturbed gravel. I looked around, flashlight sweeping every shadow, every corner. Nothing. And yet, the sense of presence remained static, cold, patient. I realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time, and when I exhaled, it sounded like a scream echoing back at me from the walls. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, though I knew it couldn't. I forced my mind to focus on something solid. The door to the station, the neon sign behind me, the faint light from the pumps. But the shadows were different now, deeper, moving in ways my eyes shouldn't perceive. A flicker at the edge of the alley, a ripple in the darkness that made my stomach twist in knots. The whispers returned, soft, almost pleased, curling around my ears, teasing, patient, knowing. I didn't know how long I stayed there. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to the store, to lock the door, to convince myself it was over. But the pull wouldn't let me. The voice, the footprints, the shadows. They had me suspended in that moment, unable to move, unable to breathe, caught between fear and something deeper, something I couldn't name. Eventually, I stumbled backward, turning toward the door to the station. The alley seemed to resist me, the shadows pooling thicker, pressing in from every side. My breath came fast and shallow, chest tight, mind screaming at me to run. I reached the door, fumbling with the handle, hands slick with sweat. I pulled it open and slammed it behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. The warmth and fluorescent light of the store felt like a reprieve, though my body shook uncontrollably. The whispers were gone. The footprints were gone. The alley outside was still dark, silent, as if nothing had ever been there. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, in my pulse, in the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Something had been there. Something that wasn't human. Something patient and waiting and very, very aware of me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat behind the counter, flashlight on, eyes glued to the monitors, but I didn't see anything else. The world outside the glass was still and ordinary, but the memory of the alley, of the whispers, of the impossible footprints, lingered, heavy, persistent, and I knew, as I stared at the darkened pumps, that it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Even now, I can feel the pull, faint but insistent, like the whisper curling at the edges of my mind. I try to tell myself I imagined it, that the night got to me, that it was nothing. But every time I picture that alley, the footprints, the cold brush of unseen presence, my heart starts a race. And I know, deep down, that one day I might be drawn back. That voice, patient and unseen, is still waiting for me. By the time I started my fourth night, I knew it wasn't just the station or the alley or the flickering lights that were getting to me. It was something else, something patient, something waiting. I could feel it even before I stepped out of the car. The neon sign buzzed weakly, casting that dull red glow over the cracked asphalt. But it didn't feel like light. It felt like a warning. I took a deep breath and forced myself to open the door. The air inside the station smelled the same: coffee, motor oil, the faint metallic tang that always seemed to cling to old fluorescent lights. I didn't want to be here, and I didn't want to see it again, but there was no choice. I'd promised myself I'd finish my shift. I'd promised myself I'd prove that I wasn't losing my mind. The monitors greeted me first. Each camera, each angle, showed only the empty store, the pumps outside, the aisles perfectly still, and yet I knew I could feel them, watching, from the shadows, from the corners, from somewhere beyond the edge of sight. I tried to convince myself it was nerves, but I knew the truth. I'd felt their eyes before, and tonight I would see them again. I started my round slowly, flashlight in hand, scanning the aisles, touching the shelves, forcing my body to move even as my mind screamed to stop. The lights flickered as usual, and each time the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, bend a little more. I could almost feel them lean, as if curious, as if waiting for me to notice. My pulse throbbed in my temples, my hands trembled, but I couldn't stop. I had to see it. I had to understand. It started with a sound, soft and deliberate, a faint creak from the far aisle, like someone shifting their weight. I froze, listening. The hum of the fluorescence filled my ears, but beneath it, I could hear a presence. Not footsteps, not breathing, just awareness. Something watching, waiting, patient. I gripped the flashlight tighter and stepped forward. The store felt larger than it should have. The aisle stretched, corners receded into darkness. The shadows pooled, thick and heavy, and I felt them move ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. Every flicker of light made my stomach churn. Every tiny movement in the corner of my eye made my heart lurch. I thought about leaving, about running into the cold night, and never looking back. But something I could not name, held me there. I reached the end of the snack aisle and froze. The shadows in the corner were darker, denser, and I swear I saw shapes shift inside them. Not human shapes, not exactly, but familiar enough to make my stomach twist. Eyes. I could feel them there, watching, pressing against me without being seen. I tried to tell myself they were tricks of the light, the fatigue in my mind, but the feeling was too precise, too deliberate. Those eyes were alive, and they were curious. I moved forward slowly, each step measured, careful, trembling. My flashlight flickered, the bulb dimming for a heartbeat. In that instant, I could feel the gaze lock onto me fully. I couldn't look directly, but I knew. I felt it everywhere at once. The store wasn't empty. It never had been. And now, whatever was had chosen me. I reached the counter and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. My chest burned, my heart hammering. I could hear the faintest whispers again, curling around the edges of my thoughts. Not words I could understand, not even sound exactly, just awareness. Something ancient, patient, waiting for me to falter. And I did. I faltered. My hand shook as I reached for the monitor controls, trying to see it, trying to prove to myself that it was real. The screen showed nothing at first. Empty aisles, silent pumps, no movement at all. And then a flicker, something, just a shadow, slid across the aisle behind the counter. Too fast to be human. Too fluid to be anything natural. I blinked and it was gone. My stomach sank. I tried to rationalize it. A trick of the lights. A reflection. But the monitors were recording, and I had seen it. I stepped back, my hands trembling, flashlight sweeping every corner of the store. The air felt thick now, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The shadows were longer, stretching unnaturally across the floor. And somewhere in the deepest darkness near the storage room, I could feel them. Eyes. Watching, patient, alive. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart, but I knew. I couldn't stop knowing. I forced myself toward the storage room, each step deliberate, shaking and slow. The door looked ordinary, harmless even, but the shadows behind it weren't. I could feel the weight of those unseen eyes pressing to the grain of the wood, through the dim light, through the air itself. I hesitated, hand on the handle. My rational mind screamed to leave, to run, to lock the door behind me and never look back. But curiosity or fear or something deeper pushed me forward. Inside, the room was empty, boxes stacked against the walls, a few cleaning supplies on the floor, dust motes swirling in the faint light. Nothing. And yet I felt it. Every inch of the room seemed alive, crawling with unseen awareness. The shadows were not shadows here. They were presence. I could feel them move along the walls, shifting, sliding, pressing toward me. My pulse pounded. My hands shook. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. Then I heard it, a soft creak, closer this time, from the corner near the door. My flashlight flickered violently, then stabilized. The air felt colder, thicker. I could feel those eyes, not behind me, not in front, but everywhere at once. They weren't human eyes. They weren't kind. They were patient, curious. They knew I was afraid, and that seemed to please them. I stumbled back, heart racing, mind screaming. I tried to focus, to find some rational explanation, but the rational had left. My flashlight beam caught nothing, just boxes, just dust, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. But the eyes were still there, unseen, watching, pressing into my skin, my skull, my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to leave everything behind, but the moment stretched heavy and long. I remembered last night, the alley, the whispers, the footprints that vanished. I remembered the flickering lights, the shadows that moved unnaturally, the pull I had felt, the voice calling me. It wasn't over. It never was. And now, it had me trapped in this room, alone with the eyes. I sank to the floor, hands gripping my knees, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced, replaying every sound, every flicker, every shift of shadow from the past nights. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew running wouldn't matter. They could follow. They could be everywhere. Always. Waiting. Patient. I could feel them now, shifting just beyond perception, pressing into every corner of my vision, crawling along the walls, sliding across the ceiling. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes became hours. The room breathed around me. The shadows pulsed with life, moving when I wasn't looking, pressing when I tried to ignore them. I felt my mind slipping, memory twisting, thoughts overlapping with the sensation of being watched, being tested, being weighed by something older, something beyond comprehension. Eventually, I forced myself to my feet, shaking, mind raw, body trembling. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. I forced the handle down, pushed against the weight in the room, and stumbled back into the main store. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, shadows stretching and twisting with every motion. I felt eyes on me the entire way, unseen and relentless. I didn't pause at the counter. I didn't linger in the aisles. I moved toward the door, toward the neon sign outside, the cold asphalt, the air that smelled like freedom. And yet, even as I stepped out, even as the station receded behind me, I could feel it. The eyes, watching, patient, waiting. I drove away in a haze, pulse still hammering, hands gripping the wheel, mind replaying every sound, every flicker, every shift of shadow. The station sat behind me, quiet, unassuming, and yet I knew better. I could feel it in my chest, in my temples, in the way the darkness lingered on the edges of perception. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Every shadow in my apartment seemed heavier. Every creak and whisper in the wind carried weight. I could see those eyes everywhere, felt them following, judging, patient. I knew that whatever it was, whatever I had seen, had not finished with me. It had made its mark. It would wait, always, in every flicker, every shadow, every corner I thought I understood. Even now, weeks later, I can feel it. The press of unseen eyes in dark corners. The soft, patient weight of awareness that doesn't belong. I try to tell myself it was imagination, that it was fear, that it was nothing. But the memory is too vivid, too precise. I know the station, the shadows, the eyes. They are real, and I know, deep down, that I will never be free of them. The radio crackled as I sat in a patrol car, the hum of the engine filling the silence of the empty streets. It was past midnight, and the town had settled into that kind of quiet that feels heavier than the darkness itself. Most nights, it was uneventful, tires crunching on gravel, the occasional barking dog, a distant car making its way down the highway. But tonight, the radio buzzed with a call that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Unit 3. We have reports of cries coming from the old St. Mary's Hospital, closed for years, overgrown and abandoned. You need to check it out, the dispatcher said, voice low but urgent, like they didn't want to admit how strange the call sounded. I sat back, letting the words sink in. St. Mary's had been shut down for nearly a decade. No staff, no patients, just an empty shell that everyone in town whispered about but avoided. Rumors of accidents, sudden deaths, strange happenings, half of it probably nonsense, the other half left unspoken. And now someone was saying they heard crying, at this hour, from an empty hospital. My partner, Morales, leaned back in his seat, rubbing his eyes. You hearing this? He asked, voice rough from fatigue. He wasn't a believer in ghosts or strange calls, but even he looked uneasy. Yeah, I said, crying from an empty hospital. We're going. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. Of course we are. Night shift always brings the weird stuff. Why do we even bother? I didn't answer. There was no point. The dispatcher had already patched the coordinates through our GPS, and the headlights of our car split the darkness as we drove toward the hospital. The road narrowed after a few miles, winding through fields overgrown with tall grass. The moon was high, pale, struggling to light our way. Everything about the trip felt off. Too quiet, too empty. Even the usual sounds, the distant hum of the highway, the nocturnal birds, the wind through the trees, were missing, leaving a vacuum I could feel pressing in from every side. The hospital came into view slowly, like it was reluctant to be seen. The old brick facade rose from the darkness, windows boarded up, paint peeling, and vines crawling like fingers along the walls. The parking lot was cracked, weeds pushing through every crevice. No lights, no signs of life, just the building, standing like a monument to time and neglect. I parked a few feet away, cut the engine, and grabbed my flashlight. The beam barely reached the main doors, but it was enough to see the rusted metal gates, the graffiti tagging the walls, the litter scattered across the cracked asphalt. Morales followed behind, shaking his head, flashlight sweeping the darkness. You hear anything? He asked quietly. Not yet, I replied, though my stomach had tightened the moment we'd gotten close. There was a stillness here that made the world feel wrong, like the town had forgotten this place existed. And yet that call, the cries, the urgency, hadn't sounded imaginary. Something had been here, or was here, right now. We approached the main entrance, the double doors warped and heavy. I pushed one slowly, and it creaked loudly in the silence. Inside, the smell hit me first. Dust, rot, something metallic like blood long dried, and a faint hint of disinfectant that refused to leave. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow, the flashlight beam bouncing off peeling paint and broken tiles. Each step echoed, sharp and hollow, making me flinch with every sound. I paused near the nurse's station. Empty drawers, overturned chairs, medical charts faded to yellow with age. My flashlight caught shadows at the far end of the hall, flickering with movement that didn't make sense. I told myself it was the building settling, the imagination of someone nervous and alone in an abandoned hospital. But even as I said it, a shiver ran down my spine. Then I heard it, faint at first, barely more than a sigh, crying, soft, desperate, echoing through the long corridor. My stomach twisted. It was human, and it was close. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Morales. He nodded, face pale. "Yeah, that's not supposed to be here." We moved slowly down the hallway, each step measured. The cries became clearer, bouncing off the walls, filling the air with sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. They weren't constant, more like intermittent bursts, low sobs that seemed to come from just around the corner, or maybe from everywhere at once. The hospital was empty. It should have been impossible. I checked the doors to the old patient rooms. Most were locked, some ajar. The hinges rusted. The cries seemed to move as we did, shifting from one corner to another, always out of reach, always just ahead. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, and that was the worst part. The sound alone would have been unsettling. The way it moved, the way it felt alive, made it worse. Morales shined his flashlight down the hall, stopping at a doorway where the crying was momentarily louder. The room beyond was dark, filled with old beds, metal frames rusted and cracked. I stepped closer, breathing shallow, hand on my weapon, not because I expected someone to be there, but because the feeling of being watched had returned, pressing against my back, crawling along my skin. The cries stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever was making them had vanished. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been, pressing against my ears, my chest, my mind. I swallowed hard. Something about this place didn't make sense. Something about this hospital, this night, was wrong. I moved toward the next corridor, flashlight sweeping the walls. Every shadow seemed to twitch when I wasn't looking, like the darkness itself was alive. The air felt colder here, thick and damp, clinging to my clothes and hair. And then I saw it, or at least I thought I did, a faint movement in the corner of the room, a shadow that didn't match the frame of a bed or a chair. I spun the light toward it. Nothing. The room was empty. The only sound was the soft echo of our boots against the tiles. We pressed on, deeper into the hospital. The cries returned, faint and distant now, weaving in and out of the walls. My mind struggled to reconcile what I was hearing with what I knew was real. An empty hospital shouldn't have cries. The walls shouldn't move. The shadows shouldn't shift when no one was there. And yet, I could feel the presence of something patient, waiting, watching from somewhere beyond the light. We reached the end of the corridor, a door labeled emergency wing. The cries seemed to intensify here, coming from somewhere inside, impossible to pinpoint. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, stomach twisting. Morales stayed close behind, flashlight sweeping, eyes wide. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us wanted to break the fragile silence with words. I turned the knob slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a long hallway lined with rooms. The smell here was stronger, metallic and sharp, like rust and old blood. The crying was louder now, more desperate, more human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence hit hard, crushing, and I felt again the weight of unseen eyes, the certainty that something was in the darkness, watching, patient, waiting. We stepped in, moving carefully. Every footstep felt loud, echoing, marking us in the empty hospital, like we were trespassing on something older than the walls themselves. I couldn't see anything, yet I felt it. The presence, behind the doors, in the shadows, between the tiles of the floor. Something was here. Something alive, though not human. And it knew we were here. Morales whispered, voice low, almost trembling. "Did you feel that?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's watching. Always watching." The hall seemed to stretch, longer than it should, walls bending slightly in the dim light. I could feel the pressure in the air, hear the faintest creaks and whispers that weren't ours. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run back to the car, to call it in and get out. But the pull of the hospital, the call of those cries, rooted me in place, forcing me to move forward, step by step, deeper into the unknown. I didn't know how long we stayed there, following the sounds, chasing the cries that seemed to vanish whenever we approached. Time lost meaning. The hospital felt alive, aware of us, shaping itself around our movements. I realized then that we weren't just walking through an empty building. We were walking through something else entirely. A space that had memory, that had hunger, that had eyes we could not see. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the stairwell leading to the basement. The crying echoed faintly from below, distant now but insistent. I hesitated, hand on the railing. Every instinct screamed to stop, but I knew I had to see it. I had to know if the cries were real or if the hospital was simply alive, feeding on fear, echoing memory. I took a step down. Morales followed. The stairs groaned under our weight. Each step a loud protest in the silence. The air grew colder, heavier, and the faint smell of rust and disinfectant mixed with something I couldn't name, something older, metallic, alive. The cries seemed closer now, surrounding us, coming from everywhere and nowhere. I swallowed hard and whispered to Morales, "Do you hear it?" He nodded, voice barely audible. "Yeah, it's not normal." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The hospital was speaking now, in whispers, in cries, in the movement of shadows just beyond the light. And I knew that whatever was down there, it had been waiting for someone to come. Something had been waiting for us. The first step inside the hospital felt like stepping into another world. The doors creaked shut behind us, and the sound echoed down the empty hallways like a warning. The smell hit me immediately, musty, damp and metallic, like old blood mixed with disinfectant left to rot. I tried to focus on my training, on the routine of patrols, but the second the door closed, the place swallowed all sense of normalcy. The lights overhead were dim, flickering intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the cracked tile floors. Every step we took made them shiver and dance along the walls. I could feel the silence pressing against me, thick and heavy, and I realized it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of it, the weight of years of stillness, of memories trapped in these walls. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. Morales followed closely behind, flashlights sweeping the hallway. I caught a glimpse of peeling paint. Old posters of hospital rules faded beyond recognition, and equipment left abandoned. Beds tipped over, a gurney with wheels frozen in place. Each object seemed to hum with history, echoing the life that had passed through here and never truly left. The first sound came almost immediately. Not a scream, not a groan, just a faint shuffling like soft footsteps on tile. I froze, flashlight beam fixed on the far end of the corridor. Nothing. The hall was empty, and yet the noise persisted, drifting closer and then fading as if moving around us rather than through the space in a straight line. My stomach twisted and I swallowed hard, telling myself it was the building settling, old pipes, air moving through the ventilation. But I didn't believe it. We moved slowly, carefully. Every echo, every whisper sound, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The hallways seemed endless, stretching further than they should, each turn revealing another corridor that looked identical to the last. The shadows pooled in corners, dark and silent, and I could feel them watching. I tried to shake the thought, to focus on our mission, but the weight of the silence made it impossible. And then I saw it, a wheelchair, empty, rusted, its wheels squeaking softly as if someone had just rolled it. I didn't move at first, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks. Morales froze beside me, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Slowly, the chair moved forward, inch by inch, with no one pushing. The sound of the wheels scraping against the tile echoed louder in the empty hall, every squeak punctuating the unnatural stillness. I stepped back, heart hammering, mind racing. "Did you see that?" I whispered. He nodded, voice low. "Yeah, I don't understand. There's no one here." I couldn't explain it. There was no breeze, no cord, nothing to push it. The wheelchair slid silently down the hallway, turning slightly at the end before stopping abruptly near a doorway. I felt a shiver crawl along my spine, cold and sharp. Whatever it wasn't human, and yet it felt deliberate, aware, like it had a purpose. We continued down the hall, every step echoing like thunder in the stillness. I could feel the weight of the hospital pressing in from all sides, the air thick and unyielding. The walls seemed to hum faintly, a vibration that went through my chest, my bones. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of history, of sorrow, of echoes of the patients who had walked these halls, who had cried, who had died and left pieces of themselves behind. The crying came next, faint and distant at first, threading through the walls like a memory. Not one voice, but many, layered and overlapping, rising and fading. I could almost make out fragments of words, desperate and soft, but they didn't form sentences. They were reminders of pain, of fear, of suffering that lingered long after the living had gone. I swallowed hard, feeling it deep in my chest. I've heard cry before on calls, in hospitals, in homes, but nothing like this. This was hollow, endless, and somehow patient, waiting for someone to hear it, to acknowledge it, to feel it. I thought of the stories, of abandoned wings, of patients who never left, of whispers in the night. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was the imagination, the exhaustion of night patrol. But the wheelchair, the sound, the weight of the walls, they told me otherwise. Morales' flashlight flicked toward a side room, the beam trembling slightly. "Look," he whispered. "Something's in there." I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop. The door was slightly ajar, darkness spilling out into the hall. I took a cautious step forward, breathing shallow, and felt the floorboards beneath my feet groan softly. There was nothing visible, just shadows pooling in corners. But the sense of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our every move, was unbearable. I could feel it in my chest, in my temples, in my gut. We passed the room slowly, flashlights sweeping every angle. The shuffling continued, faint and soft, just ahead of us, around us, as if the hospital itself had learned to mimic human movement. I imagined faces in the peeling paint, silhouettes behind the frosted windows of old patient rooms. I could feel the sorrow pressing down, thick and almost tangible, and my throat tightened. The wheelchair remained in my mind, sliding silently down the hall before stopping. I kept expecting it to appear again, to roll toward us, to move on its own, and I could feel my nerves fraying with every step. The hospital seemed alive now, aware of us, shaping the silence to remind us we were intruders. Every sound echoed too long. Every shadow stretched too far, and I knew, deep down, that nothing here was accidental. We reached the end of the hallway, a corner that led deeper into the hospital. The crying rose again, louder this time, urgent, desperate, like a tide pressing in from all directions. I stopped, flashlight trembling, and I could feel my own heart answering it, a wild rhythm that matched the invisible pulse of the building. Morales stayed close, hand on his weapon, eyes wide, unblinking. We both knew we had crossed a threshold. The air grew colder, thicker, almost viscous. My breath fogged in front of me, each exhale sharp in the silent corridor. I could feel the whispers, faint now, threading along the edges of my mind. Not voices exactly, but memories, echoes, impressions of people who had walked these halls before, suffering and waiting and leaving behind pieces of themselves. I realized then that this place was more than abandoned. It was alive in memory, in grief, in echoes that refused to fade. A sudden creak drew my attention. The wheelchair had moved again, though we hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it directly. I felt it, a subtle shift in the floor, a disturbance in the air, and my stomach dropped. Something unseen was near, deliberate, aware. The shadows stretched differently now, and I realized we were being guided or hunted by an intelligence we could not see. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to escape this place while we still could. But I couldn't. Something held me here. Some compulsion I didn't understand. The sorrow, the cries, the ghostly presence. It was pulling me forward, deeper into the hospital, deeper into its memories. We moved on, slower now, flashlight beam shaking, hearts pounding. Every doorway, every corner, Every darkened room seemed to hide eyes we couldn't see, waiting to measure us, to judge us. The crying faded and returned, a rhythm that mirrored my own terror. And all the while, the wheelchair waited, present even when unseen, a reminder that nothing here followed the rules we understood. By the time we reached the central hallway, the air was nearly suffocating, thick with the weight of unseen presences. The hospital had become a labyrinth of sorrow, a living memory of grief and fear. I realized with a cold certainty that nothing we saw, nothing we heard, was random. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper had purpose. The building was alive with it, feeding on awareness, drawing us in. I don't remember thinking of leaving. I only remember moving, compelled, guided, haunted, until the hallway ended and the whispers lingered behind us. The wheelchair did not appear again, but I could feel it, patient and waiting. I realized then fully that this hospital had eyes everywhere, unseen, unblinking, always watching. By the time we finally emerged, blinking in the faint moonlight outside, the building seemed quiet, empty, harmless, but the echoes of the hallways remained with me. Soft shuffles, distant cries, the weight of memory pressing against my mind. I couldn't shake it, and I knew I never would. Even now, I can feel the hospital around me when I close my eyes. The wheelchair glides through the corridors. The echoes of past patients linger, patient and unyielding. And I know without doubt that the hallways of silence are alive, waiting for anyone foolish enough to step inside. The moment I stepped into the old hospital's main wing, I noticed it, subtle at first, just a dark streak along the floor. I assumed it was dirt, rust, years of neglect pressed into the tiles. But as my flashlight swept closer, I saw the red sheen, glinting faintly in the dim light. Blood, fresh enough that it gleamed. My stomach churned, knotting tight. I told myself it was impossible. This hospital had been closed for over 10 years. There should have been nothing here, no one, yet the stain was unmistakable. Morales moved ahead of me, flashlight bouncing across the walls, careful steps echoing down the empty hallway. He didn't speak, but I could feel him tense, mirroring my unease. The smell hit me then, ironic, sharp, unmistakable. My throat tightened. I forced myself to swallow, telling myself it wasn't real, that someone must have broken in earlier, left this mess, maybe a vandal or drifter. Logic felt thin in this place, stretched by shadows that seemed to breathe, corners that swallowed the light. I stepped closer to the bloodstain. It trailed across the hallway, irregular, almost deliberate. There were droplets, streaks, and some that looked smeared like someone had tried to walk through them. The floorboards groaned under my boots, the sound jarring in the thick silence. My hand shook slightly, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. I wanted to leave, to run back into the cold night outside, but something, fear, curiosity, something darker, kept me moving forward toward the deeper wing of the hospital. Then I saw it, a mirror, cracked along one edge, leaning against the wall in the storage room. It reflected the hallway, the ceiling, the light, but something was off. The reflection wasn't quite right. Shadows bent differently. Corners stretched where they shouldn't. And behind me, or at least in the mirror, I saw figures. Not real, not physical, but unmistakably present. Pale, shadowed forms standing silently, watching. They didn't move, didn't blink, but I could feel them. Patient, aware, waiting. I turned, flashlight swinging wildly, expecting to see someone, anything. Nothing. Empty room. The hallway behind me was quiet. Still, ordinary. My pulse hammered. I swallowed, hand pressed against my chest, and forced myself to look back at the mirror. The figures remained. Same place, same posture, watching. Morales, I whispered, voice tight, almost breaking. Did you see them? He approached slowly, squinting at the glass. See what? I gestured to the mirror, but when he looked, the figures weren't there. Only the reflection of the hallway, the old tiles, the streak of blood on the floor. He frowned, disbelief clear in his eyes. I don't see anything. You sure you're... I didn't finish. I didn't want to sound insane, and yet the sight was burned into my vision. I could feel them, in some corner of my mind, pressing at me, patient and silent. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale, but behind it, shadows moved, figures shifting slightly just out of alignment with reality. I tried to rationalize it. Tired eyes, fatigue, imagination running wild in the dark. But then the bloodstain caught my attention again. One droplet shimmered unnaturally, as if it had just fallen. Another streak, a smear that hadn't been there before, leading toward the mirror. My stomach twisted violently. I wanted to step back, to leave, but my feet refused. Something compelled me forward, toward the reflection, toward the impossible sight. Morales stayed behind, shaking his head. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "It's just old blood, shadows, your mind." I cut him off, voice firm, though trembling. "No, look closer. Something is wrong." I raised my flashlight again, shining it directly on the mirror. The figures hadn't moved, but I felt them shift in awareness. One seemed to lean slightly, tilting its head, as if studying me, gauging my fear. Another pressed closer, not physically, but in some other way, weightless, patient. My heart thumped painfully, and I realized I could feel them, not in my eyes, but in my chest and my bones. Then the bloodstain moved, not like liquid, not like water, but it stretched, pooled, and deepened. The light reflected differently, shadows bending unnaturally. My stomach heaved as a dark smear crawled slowly toward the mirror's edge. The floor beneath it didn't shift. The substance simply seemed alive, deliberate, aware of its observer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep breathing, to stay grounded, but every fiber of my being screamed to run. I stepped closer, compelled by fear and some twisted curiosity. In the mirror, I saw my reflection raise the flashlight, and behind me, the figures shifted slightly. One seemed to emerge closer, though when I turned, there was nothing. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't name. It pressed on my skin, my mind, until it felt impossible to distinguish what was real from what wasn't. The whispering started faintly at first, curling around my ears, soft, almost coaxing. I froze, flashlight trembling, heartbeat loud in my chest. The figures in the mirror didn't speak. They didn't need words, but the weight of their awareness was palpable. Each movement, each shift in the shadows was precise, deliberate, designed to unsettle. My mind recoiled, tried to focus on logic, on reality, but the blood, the mirror, and the unseen presence conspired to pull me into something else entirely. I realized then that the hospital wasn't just abandoned. It was aware, patient, waiting for someone to notice, someone to look too closely, someone foolish enough to enter reflections and see what lay beyond the normal world. I could feel it all around me, pressing in, threading into my thoughts. It wasn't the blood. It wasn't the mirror. It was the weight behind them, older, deeper, unrelenting. Morales shifted, uneasy. "We should leave," he said quietly. "Now." I wanted to agree. I wanted to run and never return. But something kept me rooted in place. I raised the flashlight higher, shining it directly on the streaks, the smear, the reflection. The blood shimmered again, spreading slightly toward the mirror as if drawn by the figures. My stomach lurched, nausea rising, and I knew, in a way I couldn't explain, that the shapes in the mirror weren't passive. They were aware of me, measuring me, waiting for me to falter. The whispering grew slightly louder, threading around my ears, teasing, curling into the edges of my thoughts. My hands shook violently. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave, to get out of the room before it was too late. But something, some impossible, magnetic force, kept me looking, kept me rooted before the mirror. The figures shifted again, one leaning forward, just a little, tilting its head as if acknowledging me, marking me, confirming that I was seen. I forced myself to step back, finally, taking one careful, trembling step. The bloodstains remained, and the figures lingered in the reflection, patient, silent, watching. I could feel them in my chest, in my skull, pressing through some unseen connection that went beyond the mirror, beyond the hall, beyond the hospital itself. Morales gripped my arm, urging me toward the exit. "Now," he whispered, voice tight with fear. "We're leaving." I didn't resist. I followed him, heart hammering, flashlight beam bouncing across the walls. The hallways seemed endless, but the reflection stayed with me, carved into my memory. Even as we reached the stairwell, even as the faint glow of the moonlight from the broken windows spilled across the tiles, I could feel their presence. Patient, aware, unblinking, waiting. By the time we stepped outside, the night air felt impossibly thin, almost fragile. The hospital loomed behind us, dark and silent, seemingly harmless. But I knew better. I could feel it in my chest, in my mind, in the way the bloodstains glimmered in memory, in the way the mirror had reflected more than just me. Even now, I can see them when my eyes are closed. Figures that were never really there. Shadows that follow. Patient eyes behind the glass. And I know without doubt that whatever waits in that hospital, the reflection, the blood, the watching, is still aware of me, still waiting. The corridor leading to room 6 felt different from the rest of the hospital. The flickering lights dimmed more quickly here, and the air seemed heavier, thicker, colder, like it resisted my presence. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls and vanishing down the long, empty hallway. Morales stayed behind slightly, his flashlight tracing uneven arcs over peeling paint and scattered debris. Neither of us spoke. The silence had grown oppressive, as if it were listening. I reached the door marked Room 6, Operating Theater. The paint faded and chipped, the metal handle cold under my fingers. I hesitated, hand hovering over the knob. There was a sharp drop in temperature as soon as I touched it. My breath misted faintly in front of my face, though the hall hadn't been cold before. I tried to shake the unease that settled into my chest, telling myself it was just a draft, the broken ventilation, the natural decay of an abandoned building. But instinct whispered otherwise. I opened the door slowly, every creak of the hinges sounding far louder than it should have. The room beyond was dark, the overhead lights dead, but my flashlight revealed the outlines of surgical tables, metal instruments scattered across rusting trays, and old anesthesia equipment staring like the eyes of some lifeless creature. Dust floated in the beam, particles suspended unnaturally, almost like the room itself refused to settle. The cold hit me fully then, crawling along my skin, burrowing into my bones. It wasn't just the air, it was something else. The temperature dropped rapidly as I stepped in, making my fingers numb, my teeth chatter involuntarily. Morales muttered something behind me, his voice shaky, and I realized I hadn't noticed how quiet he had become. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and deliberate, almost a whisper, but undeniably present. "Come," it said. No echo, no distortion, just a single word that seemed to slide to the cold like liquid. I froze, every instinct screaming that the sound was impossible. The room was empty. I could see the tables, the walls, the broken instruments, and yet the voice had come from somewhere inside, and yet nowhere at all. "Did you hear that?" I asked Morales, my voice tight, barely audible. He swallowed audibly, eyes wide in the dim flashlight glow. Yeah, I heard it. Didn't you?" I nodded, my stomach twisting. "It's coming from, I don't know where. Room, somewhere in here." My mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossibility. Disembodied voice. Cold, so sharp it burned. The room didn't feel abandoned. It felt alive, watching, waiting. I stepped further into the operating theater, flashlight scanning every surface, every shadow. The surgical tables gleamed faintly under the beam, metal cold and worn, reflecting the light in uneven streaks. Instruments lay scattered, scalpels, clamps, forceps, but nothing moved. And yet, the sense of being observed intensified, like unseen eyes tracked every twitch of my hand, every step I took. "Be careful," Morales whispered, but he didn't take a step closer. His flashlight shook slightly as he swept the beam across the walls. I moved toward the center of the room, drawn by the voice, the cold, something I couldn't explain. Each breath I took felt sharp and shallow, my lungs burning in the freezing air. The voice called again, softer this time, beckoning, coaxing. "Come closer," it said. Not angry, not pleading, just a patient invitation. I paused, gripping my flashlight tighter. The room felt impossibly large now, stretching beyond the physical boundaries I could see. Shadows pooled along the walls, thick and dark, twisting slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. My mind tried to grasp reality, to force logic onto what I was experiencing, but it failed. There was no explanation for the cold, for the voice, for the pressure that pressed against my chest and skull alike. I noticed the operating table nearest me. The metal tray beside it glinted in the flashlight, and I could see traces of something dark smeared across it. Blood? Old. Or maybe not. My stomach twisted at the uncertainty. It was impossible to tell. The air was too thick, the shadows too alive, the sense of presence too overwhelming. The voice called again, faint now, coaxing me toward the table. Come closer. I hesitated. Every nerve screaming to retreat, to run back down the corridor, to escape this impossible place. But something compelled me forward. Not curiosity entirely, not bravery. Something deeper. Fear, maybe, or necessity, or a force I couldn't name pressing me to obey. I stepped closer to the table, flashlight sweeping around, trying to pierce the unnatural darkness that seemed to pool at the edges of the room. The temperature dropped further, so suddenly that I gasped, breath visible in front of my face. The metal instruments rattled faintly on their trays, though no one touched them. I could feel the presence behind the voice now, patient, unseen, pressing into my mind as much as the room. It wasn't malevolent exactly, but it was deliberate, aware, and I knew it measured my fear like a scale. I glanced at Morales, who stayed rooted near the door, flashlight shaking in his grip. His face was pale, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cold. I don't like this, he said, voice tight, almost breaking. We should leave. Now. I wanted to agree. I wanted to bolt. But the voice, patient and soft, pulled me forward. My feet moved almost of their own accord, and I realized with a jolt that I couldn't stop myself. The shadows shifted as I passed, twisting along the walls, pulling into corners that shouldn't exist. Every instinct in my body screamed danger, but I couldn't listen. Something here had a hold on me, subtle but unrelenting, guiding me deeper. I reached the table. The instruments shimmered faintly in the light, metal cold as ice. The voice called again, closer now, almost in my ear. Closer. I swallowed hard, body trembling, but the sound wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around me, inside me, pressing into my mind. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, in the hollow where my fear had settled. Then I noticed movement, not in the instruments, not in the table, but along the far wall. Shadows twisted unnaturally, coalescing into shapes just at the edge of perception. Figures, perhaps, or just impressions. My heart pounded. Every rational thought fled. I tried to step back, but my legs felt rooted, anchored by something I couldn't see, couldn't name. The cold pressed into my skin, my blood, making my teeth chatter despite the lack of wind. The voice whispered again, almost tender, coaxing me to look beyond the table, beyond the physical world of steel and tiles. Look, see, it said. My vision blurred the edges, the shadows bending as if alive. My mind swirled with impossible images, reflections where there were none, silhouettes behind the instruments, whispers curling in the air like smoke. The room stretched and warped, breathing with me, feeding on my fear, measuring it, patient and unblinking. I shook my head, trying to force clarity, to reclaim rational thought. It didn't work. The presence was everywhere, pressing into my chest, threading into my nerves, shaping the space itself. I felt dizzy, nauseous, caught in the gravity of the unseen. The operating theater was no longer just a room. It was a living memory, a vessel for something ancient and patient, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. I wanted to scream, to run, to call out for Morales, but my voice felt trapped, swallowed by the cold, thick air. The voice called once more, a single word stretched long and deliberate. Here, I couldn't resist. I stepped closer to the table, flashlight trembling, heart hammering, mind fraying at the edges. The shadows behind it twisted, coiling slightly, impossibly, as if anticipating my movement, encouraging it, feeding on it. Suddenly, the instruments rattled again, more sharply this time, though no wind or human presence disturbed them. I stumbled back, my hand striking the edge of the table. Pain flared, grounding me slightly in reality, but only briefly. The voice softened, patient and coaxing, threading into my thoughts. Stay watch. Morales grabbed my arm then, shaking me, voice sharp. Enough. We're leaving. Now. His grip was firm, grounding me, and I felt the cold pressing into my mind recede just enough to take a step back. The voice didn't vanish. It lingered, patient, waiting, but the immediate hold on me loosened. We backed toward the door, flashlight beams bouncing along the walls, catching glimpses of shadows that weren't entirely shadows, of shapes that weren't entirely human. The room seemed to breathe around us, alive in its silence, stretching with each step we took. I felt the weight of it in my chest, lingering even as we reached the hallway. Outside the theater, the air felt slightly warmer, though still unnaturally cold. The corridor stretched in dim light, familiar but now impossibly altered, haunted with echoes of what we'd just endured. I looked back once, flashlight trembling in my hand. Room 6 waited there, silent again, but I knew better. I knew it had watched us, studied us, and would continue to wait, patient, aware, unblinking. Even now, days later, I can feel it. The cold, the voice, the presence that isn't quite there, but never leaves. Room 6 is alive in memory, patient, deliberate, waiting for anyone who thinks they can step inside and leave unchanged. And I know that I will never forget what I felt in that theater. The cold, the whisper, and the certainty that something unseen had marked me and would not release me. We thought we were close to leaving, after what felt like hours trapped inside the hospital. The cold pressing into our bones and the whispers crawling around our minds. We finally saw the faint glow of the exit sign at the end of the corridor. My chest heaved with relief. I told myself that once we stepped outside, the weight of the hospital, the presence, the impossible things we had seen, would lift. I told myself it would be over. But as I moved toward the door, something shifted. The corridor stretched, or maybe warped. My mind couldn't tell. The exit seemed farther than it had been a moment ago, the tiles elongating in a way that felt unnatural. I glanced at Morales, flashlight beam bouncing along the walls, and I could see the same unease reflected in his eyes. His jaw tightened, hands gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "Did you see that?" he whispered, voice tight. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's like the hallway is moving." We stepped forward, cautious, hearts hammering. The door at the end of the hall didn't seem to come any closer. Shadows pooled in corners that hadn't been there before, darkened alcoves twisting at angles that didn't make sense. The air pressed against us, thick and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach turn. I realized then that leaving wouldn't be as simple as stepping outside. This hospital had other plans. The first doorway we passed shifted before my eyes. One moment it was a storage closet, plain and innocuous. The next, it seemed taller, darker, a black void that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. I blinked, certain my eyes were playing tricks. But when I looked again, the shape of the doorway had changed yet again. The doorknob was higher now, the frame wider, the shadows deeper. My stomach sank. The hospital wasn't just bending the hallways. It was bending reality. "Are you seeing this?" I asked, voice low, trying to keep my panic in check. Morales nodded, pale. Yeah, this isn't normal. We need to." He didn't finish. The floor beneath us shifted subtly, not moving, not tilting, but enough to make me feel off balance. Every step we took seemed to echo farther, longer, and the exit sign no longer glowed at the end of the hall. It had moved, or maybe the hall had. I couldn't tell anymore. My mind started grasping for explanations, tiredness, stress, exhaustion, but nothing fit. The hospital had changed the rules, and I was forced to play along. The walls seemed to breathe as we moved, expanding and contracting in ways that made no sense. Light flickered unpredictably, shadows stretching like they were alive, curling around corners, pulling in impossible angles. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying faint whispers that made my head spin. I could feel my pulse and my temples hammering, demanding that I run. But the hallway felt endless, every step forward only taking me deeper. Morales gestured to a door on the left, one that hadn't been there a moment ago. Maybe this is a way out, he said, voice shaky. I approached slowly, flashlight sweeping over the frame. The door was solid, old, but as I looked closer, I could see the faint impression of a handprint etched into the wood, smeared as though someone had pressed their palm there recently. My stomach clenched. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the unseen presence that had haunted us since we entered. Something was waiting behind that door, or maybe it was the door itself that was alive. I touched the handle. Cold, ice cold, like it had been buried in snow for hours. Morales stayed close behind, flashlight trembling. I turned the knob. The door opened easily, revealing another hallway. It looked ordinary at first, tiles cracked, peeling paint, flickering lights. But the moment I stepped through, the hallway stretched impossibly. The ceiling rose, the walls twisted, and I realized with a jolt there was another corridor that led us deeper, not out. I froze, heart hammering. It's not letting us leave, I whispered. Morales' eyes widened. We're trapped. That's impossible. There has to be an exit. I shook my head, unable to tear my gaze from the stretching corridor. No. This place, it's alive. It doesn't want us to leave. The whispers grew louder, curling around the edges of my mind. Not words exactly, just faint echoes of past patience, memories pressing to the walls, the floors, the ceilings. I could feel them watching, patient, aware. Every shadow seemed to twist at the edge of my vision, every corner pulsing with unblinking observation. The hospital wasn't empty. It had never been empty, and it would not let us go. I tried to retrace our steps, moving back toward the door we had just passed through, but it was gone. The wall was solid now, uninterrupted, smooth and seamless. I slammed my fist against it, panic clawing at me, but nothing happened. Morales was shaking, flashlight beam darting wildly across the walls. It's changing. Everything's changing, he muttered. I could feel my mind starting to fray. Hours, or was it minutes? Inside had blurred time. The corridors twisted, doubled back, stretched and warped in impossible ways. My heart raced. My hands trembled. My breath came shallow and quick. I realized that reality itself was unreliable here, bending to some unknown, patient will. The exit sign flickered faintly somewhere ahead. I moved toward it, hoping desperately that it had finally returned to its rightful place. But when I reached the spot where it had been, there was nothing. Another hallway stretched before me, darker, longer, colder. Shadows pooled thickly along the walls, and I could feel movement just at the edge of perception. I didn't want to see it, but I could feel it. Patient, aware, watching. Morales grabbed my arm. We need to get out. We can't stay here. I nodded, voice tight. I know, but we're not going to find a normal exit. Not here. The hallway seemed to pulse with the rhythm of our fear. Every step we took echoed impossibly long, carrying our presence deeper into the building. The whispers grew louder, forming layers, impossible to separate. My chest ached, my stomach turned, and I realized I could feel the hospital itself pressing against me, probing my mind, bending space around us to keep us trapped. A door appeared on the left. Again, one that hadn't been there before. I approached cautiously, hand trembling on the handle. Morales stayed close behind, flashlight casting long, uneven beams across the twisted walls. I opened the door, but it led to a room I had never seen. Another operating theater, smaller, darker, with instruments scattered across a rusted table. I swallowed hard, the cold pressing in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The whispers coiled around me, curling in my mind, tugging at memory and reason. The hospital was patient. It was aware. It did not need to rush. Time was irrelevant here. Every movement we made, every step, every breath was measured, observed, absorbed. I realized with a sickening clarity that leaving might not be possible. We moved down another corridor, each doorway shifting as we passed, some taller, some wider, some receding into shadows that seemed to pulse like dark water. I could feel my mind unraveling slightly with every twist. What was real? What was illusion? The weight of the building pressed on me, Unrelenting, patient, deliberate, Morales stayed close. But I could see the same fear in his eyes reflected back at me. We were both questioning sanity. And for the first time, I wondered if it was gone entirely. I reached a corner and froze. Shadows pulled here thicker than any before, and I could feel movement just at the edge of perception. The hallway twisted impossibly, leading in two directions at once. I tried to choose, but my mind recoiled. I realized then that every choice we made was meaningless. The hospital decided where we went, how we moved, and if we ever left. Morales' voice broke the silence. Trembling. We should have never come here. I nodded, shivering in the icy air. Yeah, we shouldn't have. And now I don't know if we ever leave. We pressed on, stepping into another corridor, another hallway that twisted like a labyrinth. The exit signs flickered faintly, always just out of reach, always misleading. Every doorway changed as we passed. Every wall stretched or narrowed, reality bending with deliberate patience. I felt my mind fraying with each step, the hospital feeding on fear, on disorientation, on our desperate need to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we collapsed against the wall of a hallway that stretched impossibly long. The whispers surrounded us, layered and patient. The cold cut into our bones. The shadows pressed close, and I realized that this hospital was alive. Not in the way of a building, but in the way of memory, of presence, of something far older and patient than we could comprehend. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the shifting doorways, the impossible hallways, the exit that... I remember driving into the forest that night, headlights cutting through the darkness, my patrol car crunching over the gravel, like it was announcing our presence to something that didn't want to be seen. The call had come in just before dusk. A hiker reported missing for nearly 12 hours. Nothing too unusual on paper, but the way the dispatcher's voice had wavered, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, made my stomach twist. The woods were silent when I arrived, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I parked near the trailhead, cutting the engine, and for a moment I just listened. Usually, even in the dead of night, you hear the forest. Owls, rustling leaves, distant howls. But tonight, nothing. Just a heavy, pressing quiet that made my ears ring. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, stepping out, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The smell of wet soil and pine filled my nose. But even that felt off, stale somehow, as if the forest was recycling its own scent. I called out softly, voice low, "Mark? Anyone here?" My words seemed to vanish almost instantly, swallowed by the stillness. I could feel a subtle tension prickling at the back of my neck. Every instinct I had, trained or otherwise, was screaming that something wasn't right. The trail was narrow, winding between towering pines and low-hanging branches. My flashlight cut through the dark, beam flickering slightly as I walked. Leaves crunched under my boots, each sound amplified in the strange quiet. I checked my radio, speaking into it again, hoping to catch a trace of Mark's call, but only static answered. The dispatcher had said he was an experienced hiker, prepared, but I couldn't shake the unease. 12 hours lost in these woods could do strange things to anyone, but this silence was abnormal. I followed the trail deeper, scanning every shadow. My mind tried to fill in gaps, to rationalize the feelings creeping up my spine. Maybe the wind had died down. Maybe the forest was unusually still because of the cold. But nothing could account for the way the darkness seemed to press against me, moving just beyond the flashlight beam, making familiar shapes appear strange, distorted. I kept imagining movement in the periphery, branches swaying slightly when I knew there was no breeze. After a few minutes, I noticed footprints, muddy, faint, almost covered by leaves, but undeniably human. They weren't fresh, but not old either, maybe a few hours. My heart picked up, but I tried to stay calm. "Mark," I whispered again, following the trail. Each step felt heavier, the shadows growing longer, twisting unnaturally around me. I noticed a tree stump ahead, carved with initials, maybe from previous hikers. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw someone crouch behind it, but when my flashlight landed fully on the stump, there was nothing, just a quiet forest, patient and unblinking. I continued along the trail, Every sound amplified in the silence. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. My flashlight swung toward the noise, but the underbrush was empty. My pulse quickened, and I felt a tightness in my chest. Something about the woods didn't feel natural. I could almost sense eyes on me, just out of view, observing, waiting. I told myself it was nerves, stress, the tension of a missing person search. But deep down I knew it was more than that. The trail opened into a small clearing. Moonlight spilled across the ground in pale, uneven patches. I scanned carefully, flashlight cutting arcs across the grass. Footprints here were deeper, muddier, and they ended abruptly, as if whoever had walked them vanished into thin air. My stomach twisted. There should have been signs, broken branches, disturbed foliage, but nothing. Just a perfect, unnerving stillness of the clearing. I radioed in, voice tight. "Dispatch! I'm at the clearing off the main trail. Footprints lead here, and then stop. No sign of Mark." Static answered. I tried again, my words trembling slightly. "Copy, dispatch. Come in." Still nothing. I felt a chill creep over me. Not from the cold, but from the realization that these woods were isolating us, disconnecting us from the outside world. I pressed on, following where the trail curved toward a ridge. The trees grew denser here, shadows clustering thickly, swallowing the light. My flashlight flickered again, briefly dimming, and for a split second I thought I saw movement. A figure just beyond the beam, small, crouched low. I froze. "Mark." I called, voice tight, careful. Nothing. The forest remained silent, immovable, patient. Each step forward felt heavier than the last. My mind started filling in shapes that weren't there. Branches becoming arms. Shadows twisting into faces that disappeared when I blinked. I shook my head, trying to force logic back into situation. Mark was probably tired, maybe resting, maybe following a different trail. I told myself that over and over, but it did little to quell the rising panic in my chest. The trail descended slightly, winding toward a creek I remember from the maps. Water should have been flowing, gurgling over rocks, creating sound, but there was nothing, just a flat, eerie calm, as if the forest had muted everything. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Again, a small shape flitting between the trees. I swung my flashlight, heart hammering, but saw only shadows. I began to feel trapped in some subtle, inescapable web, the forest stretching and bending in ways that defied sense. I came across a fallen log, moss covering it thickly, and the footprints reappeared on the other side, leading further into darkness. They were intermittent now, broken, inconsistent, as if whoever made them had been lifted in parts or perhaps shifted reality in some way. My pulse raced, every rational thought fleeing. The air grew colder, pressing down on my shoulders, carrying a faint scent I couldn't identify, something metallic, earthy, and decayed. "Mark." I called again, louder this time, stepping cautiously forward. "Where are you?" My words were swallowed instantly, fading into the unnatural stillness. I could feel my breath, fogging in the flashlight's beam, heart hammering as my feet pressed through leaves and mud. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to retreat to the car, to leave the forest and never come back. But some force, curiosity, duty, or something darker kept me moving forward. The trail opened again, a narrow strip of earth flanked by towering pines. I noticed the silence had intensified, heavier now, almost palpable. No insects, no wind, not even the distant call of a bird. It was a kind of silence that presses into your chest, that makes you imagine sounds that aren't there. I began to feel eyes watching me. No, not imagining. I could sense them in the darkness, patient, observing, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. I stopped for a moment, taking deep breaths, trying to steady my shaking hands. The flashlight beam danced across the underbrush, illuminating nothing but twisted roots and jagged branches. The footprints continued, leading slightly uphill now, toward a thick cluster of trees, but they ended abruptly once more, vanishing as if erased. My stomach turned, cold sweat running down my back. How could a human just disappear like that? There had to be an explanation, but the forest wasn't offering any. I pressed on, following the ridge carefully. Shadows stretched unnaturally as the moonlight filtered through the trees. I felt an unshakable weight pressing from all sides, as if the forest itself was alive, aware, deliberately shaping the path beneath my feet. My radio crackled faintly, a brief static that almost sounded like a whisper, but then fell silent again. I swallowed, the metallic taste of fear sharp in my mouth. I came across a large rock, half covered in moss. Footprints resumed on the other side, heading into a particularly dense patch of woods. I paused, flashlight scanning, feeling the forest watching, waiting. Something about the spot felt wrong, warped. The air shimmered faintly, the shadows bending slightly at the edges. I shook my head, trying to focus on reality, on procedure. Missing hiker, standard search, nothing supernatural. I told myself that firmly, but the feeling in my chest said otherwise. Every step forward was heavy now, the forest pressing, constricting, subtle but insistent. The trail seemed endless, repeating, twisting back on itself in ways I couldn't track. The footprints, the path, everything became unreliable, like the woods had rewritten themselves while I wasn't looking. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else, drowning out the silence. I called Mark's name one last time, voice hoarse, barely a whisper. No response, just a forest, patient, silent, unyielding. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to abandon the search until morning, but a small, stubborn part of me pressed forward, hoping, fearing, compelled to continue. The woods had swallowed him, or perhaps had always been a place where time and space didn't behave normally. I didn't know. I just knew that the silence wasn't empty. It was aware, watching, waiting. And even as I retraced my steps later, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had changed in my absence, reshaping itself, patient and deliberate, hiding its secrets just beyond reach. Even now, days later, I remember the way the shadows clung to the trees, the unnatural quiet, and the hollow feeling in my chest. The missing hiker wasn't just lost. He was claimed by the forest, by something older, something patient, and something that waited for the next person to wander too far, too curious, too alone. The deeper I went into the forest, the heavier the darkness became, pressing in from all sides like it was aware of me. The trail from the clearing where the footprints had vanished was barely visible now, hidden under fallen leaves and twisted roots. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the black, but the beam didn't seem to pierce the night. It just carved out a small, fragile circle that left everything else in deeper shadow. I stopped when I saw them, flickering lights, small and distant, hovering between the trees. At first, I thought they were campfires, maybe another search party. But as I squinted, I realized they didn't sit on the ground. They hovered midair, swaying gently, like lanterns caught in a subtle, unseen breeze. There was a faint glow around them, warm and inviting, but it didn't feel safe. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the forest around me tighten, as if it had grown impatient. "Morales," I whispered, voice barely audible over the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. "Do you see that?" He stopped behind me, flashlight trembling slightly. I could hear his shallow breaths. "Yeah, what the hell?" He swallowed audibly. "Are those lanterns?" I nodded slowly, taking a careful step toward them. My instinct screamed to stay put, to turn back, but something pushed me forward. The lights were faint now, flickering like candles, distant yet growing, inviting yet wrong. I felt a tug in my chest, subtle but insistent, as if the forest itself wanted me to follow. As I stepped closer, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was a wind, a rustling of leaves, branches brushing together. But the sound grew clearer, shaped into syllables, soft and deliberate. Come closer." I froze, heartbeat hammering. The words weren't angry or pleading. They were patient, coaxing, threading into my mind. I glanced at Morales, who shook his head slowly. I hear it too. It's whispering." We moved cautiously, flashlight beams swinging between the trees. The lanterns hovered higher now, moving slowly, almost guiding us deeper into the woods. Shadows twisted along the trunks, thick and unnatural, curling at the edges like they had substance beyond light and darkness. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every instinct screaming that this was wrong. But my legs kept moving, drawn forward by the flickering lights and the soft, persistent whispers. The forest around us seemed to change as we followed them. Trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking above us to block the moonlight. The air became colder, the dampness pressing in on my skin. Every sound was amplified. The snapping of twigs beneath our boots, the distant call of an owl somewhere far off, even our own breathing. But beneath all of it, the whispers persisted, growing more insistent, curling around my mind. I reached a small clearing, and the lanterns floated just above the ground now, circling slowly. Their light was uneven, flickering like candle flames, casting long, thin shadows that stretched toward me. I realized with a jolt that the shapes weren't quite natural. Branches seemed to bend unnaturally, shadows curving toward us in impossible angles. I swallowed hard, trying to force my racing thoughts into logic. Lanterns in the trees shouldn't move like this. Shadows shouldn't behave like they had awareness. The whispers grew louder, layering into overlapping syllables that my mind tried and failed to interpret. Here, closer, see, they weren't words exactly, more like impressions threaded through sound, suggestions pressing gently but firmly into my mind. I could feel the forest watching, patient, waiting, aware of every twitch of my muscles, every shift in my heartbeat. I looked at Morales, who was pale, flashlight clutched tightly, knuckles white. "Maybe we should go back," he said, voice tight. "I don't like this. I don't like it one bit." I wanted to agree. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, to leave the forest, to get back to the patrol car and out of this unnatural place. But the lights, soft, flickering, impossible, pulled me forward. The whispers wrapped around me, delicate but firm, tugging at the corners of my mind. I realized with a sinking sense of dread that the forest was patient. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't chasing. It was guiding, and it wanted us somewhere. We stepped carefully into the clearing, flashlight beams dancing over the undergrowth. The lanterns hovered around us now, circling slowly, casting long, thin shadows that twisted and stretched in impossible ways. Every instinct screamed danger, but I couldn't stop. My legs moved as though on their own, and I felt the pull of the lights, subtle but undeniable. A faint scent reached me then, something sweet and earthy, like flowers pressed into damp soil, but decayed just enough to make my stomach turn. The whispers grew louder, threading into my thoughts, almost tangible. I could feel them pressing into the hollow spaces of my mind, nudging me, urging me forward. "Here, see," they seemed to say, and though I tried to resist, I felt my curiosity and fear mingling into a strange, irresistible compulsion. I stepped close to one of the lights, my flashlight illuminating the surrounding trees. The lantern was small, fragile looking, but the glow around it seemed alive, almost breathing. Shadows pulled along the trunks, thick and dark, curling at the edges like smoke. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw figures among the trees, slender, dark shapes that disappeared when I blinked. I swallowed hard, trying to force calm into my racing heart. Morales stayed close, voice low and tense. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't right. I know it isn't right." I nodded, but I couldn't pull myself away. Something deeper than fear, something instinctive, was keeping me rooted, tethered to the lights. The whispers wrapped around me again, softer now, almost gentle, almost comforting. "Come closer, follow." I felt the forest itself pressing against my skin, nudging me toward the center of the clearing. The air grew colder still, dampness clinging to my clothes, my skin prickling. I noticed the ground beneath the lanterns was different, covered in a thin layer of mist that hadn't been there before, curling and rising in ghostly tendrils. The shadows danced across it, twisting and stretching in ways that made no sense. I could feel my pulse hammering, every nerve in my body alive with tension and fear, yet I was drawn forward, compelled by some unseen force. I stepped into the mist, flashlight beam cutting arcs over the swirling fog. The lanterns floated closer, circling above the ground, shadows bending toward them. My mind screamed that this was wrong, that we should leave, that whatever force wanted us to see was dangerous. But the whispers were insistent, patient, weaving through my thoughts with subtle power I couldn't resist. I looked at Morales, who seemed frozen in place, eyes wide, flashlight shaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, words failing him. The forest was pressing on both of us now, subtly, inexorably. We were no longer just searching for a missing hiker. We were inside something older, something patient, something aware, and we were being guided whether we wanted it or not. The lanterns moved closer still, hovering just above the mist now. Their light flickered across the trees, revealing glimpses of the impossible. Branches bent at unnatural angles, shadows pooling into shapes that seemed almost human, only to dissolve when I looked directly. My chest tightened. I realized with a jolt that we were not alone. The forest, the lanterns, the whispers, they were aware of us, studying us, waiting. I tried to step back, to retreat to the familiar trail, but the mist seemed to shift beneath my feet, tugging me forward. The whispers grew louder, threading into my thoughts, suggesting, coaxing, patient and deliberate. It's a follow here. I felt my mind straining against the influence, trying to hold on to reason, onto reality, but the forest's patience was overwhelming. Morales grabbed my arm then, shaking me. We have to go. Now. Please. His voice was tight, desperate, grounded me slightly in reality. I nodded, heart hammering, and forced myself to step backward, the lantern circling us slowly, patient, not angry, not threatening, just waiting. We retraced our steps, flashlight beams cutting over the shifting mist, over shadows that clung too closely to the trees. The lanterns remained behind, flickering faintly, hovering in the darkness like distant stars, patient and eternal. The whispers faded slowly as we moved, but their memory lingered, threading into my thoughts in ways I could not shake. Even after we emerged from the clearing, back onto the main trail, I could still feel the forest's presence, subtle and patient, shaping the shadows at the edge of my vision, lingering in the corners of my mind. The lanterns were gone now, but the memory of their light, their movement, and the patient whispers that guided us would never leave me. I knew then that the forest was alive, aware, and waiting, and anyone who wandered too far, anyone who followed the flickering lights, would feel the same pull I had, a quiet, insistent insistence that drew you deeper into something older, something patient, something that did not allow you to leave unmarked. The deeper we went into the forest, the more I felt that we were being watched. The air was heavy, damp, pressing down on my shoulders, and every step I took seemed to echo in the silence like it belonged to someone or something else. It was Morales who noticed it first, his flashlight beam flicking to side. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice tight. I froze, my ears strained. The forest was silent again, but something had shifted in the shadows, just beyond the trees. I thought I saw movement, a humanoid shape darting between the trunks. For a moment, I told myself it was a trick of the light, a trick of exhaustion, but then it moved again, fleeting, impossibly quick, vanishing before I could focus on it. My stomach twisted. I wanted to convince myself it was a deer, maybe a lost hiker, but the shape was upright, deliberate, human-like. No ordinary animal moved like that. I whispered, "There's something there behind the trees." Morales gripped his flashlight tighter. "It's probably just the shadows, maybe a trick of the light." But I could hear the edge in his voice, the same unease that had been pressing on me since the clearing with the lanterns. We pressed forward cautiously, the trail narrowing as we walked between towering pines. The ground was littered with dead leaves and broken branches that cracked under our boots. And then, a sharp snap from the underbrush, close, almost at my side. I swung my flashlight toward the noise, heart hammering, but there was nothing, just empty darkness and the slow sway of branches in the still air. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just the trees, it has to be. But even as I said it, I knew the forest wasn't normal tonight. Not after the footprints, not after the lanterns, not after the whispers. There was awareness here, patient and careful, and it wasn't human. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch as we moved. Shapes darted just at the edge of our vision, quick and deliberate, human in form but impossible in movement. Every time I swung the flashlight toward them, they vanished, leaving only the quiet, empty forest behind. My pulse rattled in my ears, loud and insistent, as if the forest was timing it, measuring my fear. I noticed then that the trees themselves seemed different. Branches reached out at angles that made no sense, knotted and twisted like fingers. Every now and then, a branch snapped, sometimes under our feet, sometimes above. But whenever I looked, there was no one there. My hand shook slightly as I gripped my flashlight, trying to convince myself that I wasn't imagining things. But my mind was already teetering. Morales stayed close, voice low. We shouldn't be this far in. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. I nodded, though I could feel the forest pressing me forward. There was a pull here, subtle but undeniable, a patient force guiding us through the trees. I tried to resist it, tried to remind myself that we were looking for a missing hiker, not chasing shadows, but every instinct told me the forest had other plans. Then I saw it again. A shape, tall, thin, humanoid, darted behind a tree. Not fully human, not fully solid. Just a shadow, a suggestion of movement. The faint impression of something waiting, watching. I froze, heart hammering, flashlight trembling in my hand. I called out softly, "Mark?" Even saying his name felt ridiculous. There was no Mark here. Only us and whatever lurked just beyond the light. The whispers returned, faint, layering with the crack of branches. Not words, not quite, but suggestions, pressures in my mind, nudges that made me glance at the trees, even when I didn't want to. Here. Closely, I felt the forest's patience pressing against me, urging me forward, coaxing my curiosity, feeding my fear. I moved carefully, each step deliberate. The forest was watching. Every shadow, every tree, every twitching leaf seemed to hold awareness. Another branch snapped, closer this time, and Morales jumped, flashlight beam swinging wildly across the trunks. But again, there was nothing, just shadows, shifting and curling in ways that made no sense. A faint fog began to settle over the forest floor, curling around roots and trunks, distorting the shapes of shadows into forms that were almost, but not quite human. I could see them move, fleeting glimpses of figures that seemed aware of our presence, waiting for a moment to emerge fully. My chest tightened, every instinct screamed to run, but my legs moved forward, compelled, drawn into the forest's patient game. I noticed that the footprints we had been following earlier were back, faint in the dirt, but inconsistent. They didn't follow a straight line. They twisted, doubled back, disappeared, reappeared in ways that made no sense. Whoever, or whatever, had made them wasn't bound by normal movement, and the shapes in the trees seemed connected, guiding, herding us towards something deeper inside the forest. "Do you see them?" Morales whispered, voice shaking. I nodded, heart pounding so loud I could feel in my throat. Yeah. There, behind the trees, watching. The shadows darted again, and I caught a glimpse of movement. Too quick, too precise, almost deliberate. I swallowed hard. They're not human. They can't be. A branch snapped directly ahead, startling me, and I swung my flashlight toward it. The shape was gone, but the space it had occupied felt wrong, like it had left a faint imprint on the air itself. My stomach churned with unease. I realized then that the forest wasn't just hiding something. It was shaping reality around us, bending it, guiding us, patient and careful. We continued along the twisting trail, stepping over roots and fallen leaves, flashlight beams cutting arcs through the dense fog. Every so often, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, figures darting between the trees, never stopping, always just beyond reach. The whispers pressing again, gentle and insistent, threading through my thoughts, coaxing, nudging. I could feel the forest itself breathing, patient, alive, aware. I tried to keep my focus on the trail, on following the footprints, but the forest was too strong. The shapes in the trees were patient hunters, shaping our path without ever revealing themselves fully. I felt my mind beginning to fray under the pressure, the subtle manipulation, the constant uncertainty of what was real and what was suggestion. Another branch cracked, this time behind us. I spun, flashlight swinging wildly, but nothing but the dense black forest, the fog curling at the bases of the trees. Morales whispered something, almost inaudible, and I realized my own voice had become tight, hoarse, brittle. Fear had soaked into my bones, deep, unshakable. We pressed forward, the trail twisting impossibly, stretching in ways that didn't make sense. Every shadow, every branch, every rustle carried a suggestion of movement, of awareness. I could feel the eyes on us, patient and deliberate, always just behind the trees, always observing, never fully revealing themselves. At some point, the fog thickened, curling around our legs, slowing our steps, making every movement heavy, deliberate. The shapes darted again, always fleeting, always tantalizingly close. My chest ached, my stomach churned, and I realized that the forest wasn't just hiding something. It was alive, aware, patient, and very old. I tried to call out again, to break the tension, to remind myself that this was still a search, still reality. Mark! My voice sounded small, fragile, swallowed by the immense stillness. The shapes didn't respond. They didn't need to. They were watching, patient, deliberate, shaping the forest around us with a subtle, inescapable presence. Branches snapped all around, some underfoot, some above, echoing like deliberate signals, like the forest itself was speaking in a language I didn't understand. I could feel my mind fraying with the uncertainty, with the constant pressure of something just out of reach, always shaping the shadows and the path we took. Morales grabbed my arm. "We need to stop. We need to figure this out." His voice trembled. I nodded, swallowing hard, my throat dry, my chest tight. We paused in a small clearing, fog curling around our ankles, lantern light illusion lingering faintly in the distance from before. The shapes were behind the trees, patient, waiting, unblinking in the shadows. I realized then that the forest had claimed the edges of my mind. It was teaching me patience, testing me, shaping my fear into something I could watch, enjoy, manipulate. The humanoid shapes darted just out of reach, but I could feel them in every twitch of my nerves, every flash of movement in my peripheral vision. And as we pressed forward again, flashlight beams trembling, hearts hammering, I understood the truth. The forest was patient. The shadows were deliberate, and the shapes behind the trees were never meant to be fully seen. They were a warning, a test, a proof that the forest itself was alive, aware, and always watching. Even now, after leaving the woods, I can feel the way of those eyes, the brushing of shadows at the edge of vision, and the memory of branches snapping, each one deliberate, each one echoing with something that was not human. The shapes behind the trees were still there, patient, waiting, and I knew that anyone who wandered too far, who followed the whispers or the flickering lights, would feel them too, always just beyond reach, always watching. I don't even know how long I'd been walking when I realized I was completely, impossibly lost. The trail that had led us this far, twisting through the dense forest, had vanished, or maybe it had never been real. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but its beam only made the forest feel deeper, more endless. I called out for Morales, my voice tight and hoarse. "Morales!" The sound seemed swallowed instantly by the blackness, echoing faintly, then vanishing. I waited. Nothing. The silence was thick, oppressive, like a weight pressing into my chest. My stomach churned. Every instinct I had screamed that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear anyone. Nothing but the faint, unnatural rustling of leaves. I stumbled forward, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Branches scratched my arms and face as I pushed through them, the underbrush growing thicker, darker, more oppressive with every step. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. Fatigue, stress, the tension of searching for a missing hiker. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something had changed here. Something in the forest had shifted, and I had been drawn too far in. The shadows were different now. They moved in ways that weren't consistent with the trees or the underbrush. They seemed alive, curling and twisting just at the edge of my vision. When I swung my flashlight toward them, they would vanish, only to appear again moments later, closer, patient, deliberate. I felt my heart hammering, each beat echoing in my ears louder than the sound of my own breathing. I stopped for a moment, trying to get my bearings. I turned slowly in a circle, flashlight sweeping over the dense forest. Nothing looked familiar. The shapes of the trees shifted subtly, as if they had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. My pulse quickened. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was no longer in a place that obeyed normal rules. The forest was bending reality around me, reshaping itself, patient and careful. Morales. I called again, voice cracking slightly. No answer. I swallowed, dry mouth burning, and forced myself to take another step. The ground beneath me felt uneven, unfamiliar, though I thought I had been on this trail minutes before. Every movement seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound swallowed by shadows that pressed closer, curling toward me like living things. A faint fog had begun to settle over the forest floor, curling around roots and trunks in ghostly tendrils. The mist made every shadow stretch and twist, turning ordinary branches into impossible shapes. I caught movement in my peripheral vision, slender forms darting just beyond the flashlight beam, disappearing when I tried to look directly. My chest tightened. Fear twisted inside me like a living thing, sharp and unrelenting. I forced myself to move forward, though every instinct screamed to turn back. Each step was deliberate, heavy, cautious. The whispers were back, soft and layered, threading through my mind again. They weren't words, not really, but suggestions, nudges, pressures pressing gently into my thoughts. Here, closer, follow. The forest itself seemed to be speaking through the shadows, guiding me, testing me, patient and deliberate. I stumbled over a gnarled root and caught myself on a tree trunk, breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The forest seemed to close in around me. Branches leaned overhead, blocking what little moonlight filtered through. Shadows pooled at the bases of the trees, curling in ways that made no sense. My flashlight flickered briefly, beam wavering, and I felt a jolt of panic. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. Every tree, every shadow, every root looked the same as the next. I turned in circles, heart racing, until my flashlight caught movement. A figure faint just beyond the edge of the beam, human in shape, but impossibly tall and thin. I blinked. It vanished. My chest tightened. I realized I couldn't trust my eyes here. Couldn't trust my perception at all. The whispers grew stronger, pressing against my thoughts, threading into the hollow spaces in my mind. I felt the forest patience pressing in, subtle but insistent. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't threatening. It was guiding, shaping, waiting. My rational mind screamed to resist, to leave, but the fear and curiosity twisted together, a knot in my chest that propelled me forward despite myself. I stumbled into a small clearing, or maybe it was the same clearing I'd been in before. I couldn't tell. The fog curled around my legs, curling like fingers, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. Shadows moved in impossible ways, stretching along the trunks, pulling on the mist, forming shapes that seemed aware of me. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming danger. Branches snapped behind me. I spun, flashlight swinging, but nothing. The air was too still, too heavy, pressing against my skin, my lungs, my mind. I could feel eyes everywhere, patient, deliberate, unblinking. I realized I had no idea which way was forward, which way led back. I was truly impossibly alone. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The whispers pressed against me again, weaving around my thoughts. Here, see, follow. I tried to shake them off, telling myself it was my mind, exhaustion, stress. But the pressure was real, tangible, curling around my brain like a living thing. I forced myself to move, step by slow step, scanning the forest with my flashlight. Shadows shifted and stretched. Trees seemed to bend subtly, their trunks curling in impossible angles. My pulse hammered. The forest was patient. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It waited, guiding me, shaping my path, keeping me exactly where it wanted me. I stumbled over another root, falling to my knees. My hands shook as I gripped the earth, trying to ground myself. I could feel the subtle tug of the forest, nudging me forward, coaxing me, patient and deliberate. The whispers wrapped around my mind again, soft, almost gentle, suggesting movement, guiding my steps. I looked at the fog curling around my ankles and realized the shadows were moving within it. They were not separate from the darkness. They were the darkness, stretching, twisting, bending, aware. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs refused to obey. I was trapped in a forest designed, patient, deliberate, unyielding. Hours, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, passed. Time had lost all meaning. The forest stretched endlessly, the shadows shifting and twisting with a slow, deliberate patience. My flashlight flickered intermittently, each pulse of light revealing glimpses of forms just beyond comprehension. Tall, thin, impossibly fast shapes that vanished when I looked directly. My chest ached with the effort of holding on to my own sanity. I realized then that I was truly alone. Morales was gone, vanished, and I couldn't even remember which direction we had come from. Every tree, every shadow, every whisper seemed designed to disorient, to fracture my perception. I felt the forest pressing into my mind, patient, aware, unrelenting. The whispers grew faintly louder, almost melodic, threading into my thoughts in subtle, insistent patterns. I could feel my mind fraying, delicate strands of reason unspooling. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I forced one foot in front of the other, unsure if I was moving closer to something or just deeper into the forest trap. Branches cracked all around, each one deliberate, precise. I flinched, flashlight swinging, trying to catch whatever caused the sound. But the forest remained silent, patient, deliberate. Shapes darted between the trees just beyond the light, fleeting, impossible, human but not human, patient and aware. I stumbled into a small hollow, fog curling thickly around me. The shadows pulled in strange, impossible ways, and I realized with jolt that the forest itself was bending, reshaping the space around me. My legs trembled, hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight tighter. I was completely, impossibly disoriented, caught between fear, awe, and the slow, suffocating weight of the forest awareness. The whispers pressing again, soft but insistent, coaxing me, guiding me, patient and deliberate. I tried to resist, tried to force myself to turn back, to retrace my steps, but the forest would not allow it. Every tree, every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush was designed to disorient, to break my mind, to make me feel small, isolated, utterly alone. I sank to the ground for a moment, chest heaving, flashlight beam trembling. The fog curled around me like fingers, brushing against my skin, moving with intent. Shadows danced just beyond the light, fleeting and impossible. My heart pounded, fear gnawing at every corner of my mind. I realized I wasn't just lost in the forest. I was lost in something older, patient, deliberate, something that understood fear and waited endlessly for the next step, the next choice, the next misstep. Even as I forced myself to stand and continue, the disorientation remained thick and heavy, pressing into my mind. Every sense told me I was trapped in a space that was no longer governed by the rules I knew. The forest itself was alive, aware, patient, shaping reality around me in subtle, impossible ways. I walked, stumbled, and stumbled again, the whispers threading through my thoughts, the fog curling around my legs, the shadows stretching and twisting just beyond comprehension. I realized with shiver that I might never find a way out, that the forest had claimed me, patient, deliberate, aware, and waiting. And as I moved forward through the warped, endless darkness, I understood one thing clearly. I was alone, truly alone, lost among shadows in a place older than time, where reality bent and dread had substance, and the forest watched patiently, deliberately, eternally. The first thing I noticed when I started my night shift at the Cedar Pines Motel was the silence. Not the quiet you expect when everyone's asleep, not the soft, comforting quiet of a place at rest, but heavy, pressing kind of silence that seemed to settle over the building like dust. I'd worked night shift before plenty of times, but this place was different. The hum of the fluorescent lights was faint, almost drowned out by the stillness, and the walls themselves seemed to absorb sound. I unlocked the front door just after 10 and stepped inside. The lobby was empty, as expected. A dusty carpet stretched from the entrance to the reception desk, patterned with faded geometric shapes that might have once been colorful, but now were muted into dull reds and browns. I flipped on the overhead lights, the harsh fluorescent buzzing filling the space briefly, then settling into that low hum. All right, I muttered to myself, dropping my keys and flashlight on the desk. Just a regular shift. Check rooms, make sure everything's secure. I tried to convince myself it was a routine night, but the air had weight to it, like it was slightly thicker, harder to breathe. I shook my head and forced a laugh. Probably just nerves, I thought. First night and new job always feels like that. The first few rooms were empty as expected. I walked the halls slowly, tapping doors gently, listening for any sound of movement or life. The carpet muffled my footsteps, but still, the sound seemed to echo oddly, carrying further down the corridor than it should. By the third room, I started to notice something strange. A faint smell, metallic and sour, like old iron mixed with damp fabric. Not enough to make me gag, but enough to set my teeth on edge. I paused in the middle of the hallway, flashlight beams sweeping over the doors. The smell was strongest near room 312. I tilted my head, trying to pinpoint it. My pulse quickened. No one should be here. The room was supposed to be vacant. I knocked lightly. No answer. The door was closed, but the faint draft of cooler air from the crack beneath it made my skin prickle. Just a leaky vent or some old plumbing. I told myself, but my voice sounded then unsure. I pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. Just the low, steady hum of the building, the occasional groan of the old structure settling. Still, the smell was stronger here, curling around me, subtle but insistent. I took a cautious step back and shined my flashlight down the hall. Shadows stretched long and thin under flickering light, like black fingers pointing toward me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. I moved on, checking the other rooms. Nothing. Empty beds, clean sheets, dust settling into corners, nothing out of the ordinary. But every time I passed room 312, that smell lingered at the edge of my senses, faint but impossible to ignore. And every time I glanced at it, I felt something in the shadows move, or maybe it was just the corner of my eye. My stomach tightened. I reached the end of the hall, the emergency exit door standing silent and still. I checked it quickly, then started back toward the lobby. That's when I noticed it, a subtle draft brushing against my neck, carrying the faint metallic scent with it. The lights above flickered briefly, casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. My hand tightened around my flashlight, knuckles white. I tried to laugh again, a weak, hollow sound. It's nothing, just the building. Old place, weird air circulation. But even as I said it, my rational mind was fighting the growing unease curling in my chest. There was something about the way the shadows clung to the corners, the way the carpet seemed to sag unnaturally under the ceiling lights, the way the smell seemed to linger only in one corridor. My pulse kept pace with my thoughts, sharp and insistent, and I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked slowly back toward room 312, flashlight beam steady, focusing on the door this time. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air felt, heavier, like it carried the weight of something unseen. I stopped a few feet away, heart hammering, and shone the light over the doorknob. It glinted faintly, cold and indifferent. I could feel the darkness pressing from the corners of the hall, patient, silent, watching. I wanted to call it a trick of my imagination. Really, that's all it could be. Old buildings played with your mind, especially at night. Shadows seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Strange smells were probably from the plumbing or the carpet. Rational thought, I told myself, keep it rational. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The door frame, normally straight and solid, seemed to warp subtly, edges bending in ways that didn't make sense. I blinked, thinking I'd imagine it, but when I looked again, it was still there, a subtle curve, like the building itself was breathing, bending slightly around the room. My throat went dry, and I swallowed hard, flashlight beam trembling. The smell was stronger now, curling in waves, sweet and metallic, like copper warmed by heat, mixed with something older, decaying. I took a hesitant step closer, breath shallow, and that's when I thought I heard it, a faint scraping, soft, deliberate, coming from inside the room. My pulse shot up. The sound stopped immediately when I froze. I strained my ears. Nothing. Only the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Hello. My voice sounded too loud in the silence, harsh against the still air. No answer. Just a building, patient and waiting, carrying that faint, insistent smell. I wanted to back away, run even, but my feet moved closer anyway, drawn by some curiosity I couldn't explain, some compulsion that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I edged along the corridor, flashlight beams sweeping the room numbers. Shadows stretched long and thin, dancing just at the corners, moving slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I felt my skin prickle, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My rational mind struggled to keep control, but deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. The door to 312 loomed ahead, silent and closed, breathing almost imperceptibly in the still night. The air around was thick, almost palpable, curling around me like smoke. I raised my hand to the knob, cold and metallic under my fingers, and a shiver ran down my spine. I realized I could feel the room itself, the air vibrating faintly, alive in some subtle, imperceptible way. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself, blinking rapidly to clear the tension from my mind. I told myself I'd just look inside, check the room, make sure there was nothing there. That was all. Nothing more. Just routine. Just a vacant room with a weird smell. I turned the doorknob slowly. The door creaked softly, swinging inward, and the smell hit me fully then, thick and metallic, almost choking. The room was dark, deeper than the rest of the hall, as if the shadows themselves pooled there. The bed was empty, sheets neatly tucked, nothing moved, and yet the air felt wrong. Heavy, watching, patient. I swallowed hard, flashlight trembling in my hand, and stepped inside. The carpet underfoot was damp in places, though the rest of the room was dry. The shadows pooled in corners, curling slightly, and for a brief second I thought I saw movement, faint, impossible, a suggestion of a figure just beyond the light. My heart slammed in my chest. I forced myself to look around the room systematically. Nothing, just the furniture, the empty bed, the closet closed. But that smell, it lingered, curling into the edges of my senses, persistent, unnatural. My pulse slowed slightly as I focused on breathing, trying to ground myself. It had to be nothing. Really, just a vacant room. Old building. Weird air. I took another step. Flashlight beams sweeping across the floor and walls. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, soft, barely audible, carried in the still air. I froze, flashlight trembling, heart hammering. The voice didn't form words, just a subtle intonation, patient and deliberate, threading into my mind, curling around my thoughts. My stomach knotted, and I realized I wasn't alone in the way I had thought. I took a cautious step back toward the door, turning to leave. The shadows seemed to shift slightly as I moved, almost alive, curling toward me. The whispering continued, faint but insistent, threading through my mind, coaxing, patient. I could feel the room watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, chest tight, and hurried out of the room, closing the door behind me, back in the corridor. The smell lingered faintly, the shadows stretching long and thin. I shined my flashlight down the hallway, heart still racing, trying to convince myself it was just nerves, just a first night, just a building. But deep down I knew better. Something had been there. Something patient, deliberate, unseen. I walked the rest of the hall quickly, checking doors, confirming they were empty. Every step made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edge of my vision. By the time I returned to the lobby, the fluorescent lights above hummed softly, the silence pressing down again. I tried to shake it off. Tried to remind myself it was just a vacant room, just a strange smell, just a building that had been around too long. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the weight in the air, the shadows, the faint whispering, the way the room seemed alive, patient, watching. I sat at the reception desk, flashlight still in hand, and tried to focus on my paperwork. But the memory of that corridor, that smell, that room, it lingered, pressing into my thoughts, patient and deliberate. The night had just begun, and I already felt the first stirrings of something I couldn't name. Something that wouldn't let me forget. Something that was still there, waiting, patient, unseen, and aware. I couldn't stop thinking about that smell in the corridor, the way the shadows seemed to cling to the corners, patient, deliberate. It had been there for hours, subtle but impossible to ignore, threading through my mind. By the time I decided to check room 213, I knew I was already tense, every nerve on edge, heart hammering in my chest like a warning drum. The hallway stretched out before me, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. The other rooms were quiet, empty, mundane. But as I approached 213, I felt that same oppressive weight pressing down. My hand tightened on the flashlight, the beam wobbling slightly. I could see the door at the end of the hall, pale wood and brass handle, unremarkable in every way. But somehow it felt different. The air around it seemed heavier, the shadows darker. I paused before the door, listening. Silence. My own breath sounded loud, uneven, echoing faintly in the stillness. I told myself it was just nerves, nothing more. I had worked enough night shifts to know how the mind plays tricks in empty corridors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching, just beyond the threshold. I turned the knob slowly. The metal was cold under my fingers. The door creaked as I pushed it open and I stepped inside. The air hit me first, dense and slightly chilled, carrying that faint metallic smell that had lingered in the hallway. The room was empty, or at least it should have been. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, the carpet dusted. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, it wasn't right. I swung my flashlight across the room, trying to reassure myself. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners, stretching along the walls in ways that made my stomach tighten. I focused on the furniture, table, chairs, dresser, all ordinary enough, but I could swear the chair by the window had shifted slightly since I entered. My pulse spiked, just moved it without noticing. I whispered to myself. My voice sounded hollow in the quiet room, but I knew it hadn't. I had been watching the space, focusing on it. Nothing else could have moved the furniture, and yet the chair had shifted, slightly turned, as if it had been nudged by invisible hands. I approached the dresser slowly, flashlight beam sweeping over the surface. Nothing was on it except for a small lamp, dust motes drifting in the light like tiny, aimless spirits. I reached out to touch the lamp, half expecting it to move on its own. My fingers brushed the cool metal, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I noticed the mirror, mounted on the wall above the dresser. It reflected the room, or at least it should have. I stepped closer, and my stomach dropped. The reflection wasn't right. It lagged slightly, my movements delayed by a fraction of a second. In the corner of the mirror, I saw something that wasn't there in the room itself. A shadowy figure, tall and thin, hunched slightly, just behind the chair. I spun around. Empty room. Nothing. My flashlight beam swept over the space. Nothing moved. I backed away slowly, heart hammering, but the reflection remained. The figure lingered, silent, still, patient. In the mirror, my mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Was it fatigue? A trick of the light? A misalignment in the glass? But deep down, I knew it wasn't a trick. Something in that reflection was aware, deliberate, observing. I swallowed hard, tried to force myself to breathe normally, but my chest was tight, lungs constricted. The chair creaked behind me. I froze. My flashlight wavered in my hand. Slowly, deliberately, I turned. Nothing. Empty room. But the air had shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, icy fingers curling along my arms. My breath fogged faintly in the beam of the flashlight. I tried to reassure myself. Try to tell myself it was just the old air conditioning or draft. But the unease crawling along my spine was undeniable. I focused on the mirror again. The reflection hadn't moved, still showing the figure just behind the chair, head tilted slightly as if studying me. I shook my head violently, blinking hard, trying to erase it from my mind. When I opened my eyes again, the reflection shifted just slightly, closer to me, patient, deliberate. I stepped back. The floor beneath my feet seemed to groan softly, echoing in the stillness. "Stop it," I muttered under my breath. My own voice sounded weak, unconvincing. I turned and tried to focus on the room itself. Scanning every inch with the flashlight, everything was in place. Bed, dresser, table, chair, all normal. Nothing out of place. Nothing that could have moved on its own. And yet, the mirror insisted otherwise, reflecting something that shouldn't exist, something patient and deliberate. I took a cautious step toward the door, flashlight beams sweeping the corners. The shadows seemed to twitch, curling slightly as if they were alive, breathing in rhythm with me. The metallic smell was stronger now, curling into my nostrils, almost sweet, almost decayed. I swallowed hard, throat dry. The chair moved again. Just a fraction, a subtle shift that made my stomach knot. I backed up toward the dresser, flashlight trembling, and forced my eyes on the mirror. The figure was closer now, taller, more defined, though still impossible, insubstantial, watching. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat echoing in the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, exhausted from the night shift, the emptiness of the building pressing on me. But the movements of the furniture, the reflection in the mirror, the oppressive weight of the air, they weren't illusions. They were deliberate, patient, aware. I stepped closer to the mirror, heart hammering, trying to get a better look. The figure's head tilted again, mimicking me slightly, deliberate in its patience. I flinched, realizing it wasn't just following me. It was anticipating me, mirroring me, but wrong, subtle, uncanny. My stomach churned, a deep, visceral unease settling in my chest. A floorboard creaked behind me. Slowly I turned. The room was empty, yet I could feel the presence there, patient, deliberate, just beyond perception. I gripped the flashlight tighter, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, compelled to watch, compelled to witness. I looked back at the mirror. The figure's reflection was closer still, almost filling the space behind the chair now. Its edges were indistinct, wavering, yet the sense of awareness, of deliberate observation was unmistakable. My stomach twisted. I realized then that I was not alone in the room. Not physically, perhaps, but mentally, spiritually. Something was here, patient, deliberate, shaping the space, the reflection, the very air around me. The metallic smell was thick now, curling through the room, pressing into my senses. I could hear a faint whispering, soft, almost indistinct, threading into my mind. My pulse raced. I forced myself to turn away from the mirror, flashlight sweeping the walls, the corners, the furniture. Nothing. The room was empty. Yet I could feel it, just beyond the edge of perception, patient, deliberate, watching. I forced myself to step toward the door. Every step felt heavy, weighted by the oppressive presence lingering in the room. The shadows stretched toward me subtly, curling at the edges, bending in impossible ways. The mirror remained behind me, reflecting what wasn't there. The figure patient and deliberate, waiting. I reached the door, hand on the knob. I paused, heart hammering, taking a final glance over my shoulder at the mirror. The figure lingered, still just beyond comprehension. A shadow with a reflection, aware and patient. I turned the knob and pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the hallway. The metallic smell lingered faintly, shadows stretching long and thin under the fluorescent lights. I leaned against the wall outside the room, breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The quiet of the corridor pressed down on me, oppressive, heavy, but safer than that room. Room 213 had a presence I couldn't explain, a patience, a deliberate awareness that clung to the walls, the air, the mirror. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer, not without losing myself to it. I walked the hall slowly, flashlight sweeping the doors, trying to focus on routine tasks, trying to reassure myself that I was safe out here. But even as I moved, I could feel the memory of the reflection of the figure just behind the chair, patient and deliberate, lingering in my mind. It followed me in thought, curling around my thoughts like smoke, persistent, unseen, aware. By the time I returned to the reception desk, heart still hammering, hands trembling, I realized something I couldn't ignore. Room 213 wasn't empty. It had never been empty, not entirely. And whatever had been inside, patient and deliberate, was still there, watching, waiting, shaping shadows and reflections, and I knew I would never forget it. I shouldn't have gone back. I knew that the moment my feet carried me toward the end of the hallway, where room 213 waited. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang I'd come to associate with that room, and the shadows clung to the walls in ways that didn't make sense. curling slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. But something inside me insisted on checking once more, as if the building itself was daring me, challenging me to face whatever lingered there. The door loomed ahead, pale and unremarkable, yet I could feel it, that presence, the weight of it, pressing subtly into my chest, patient and deliberate. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the knob. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting the corridor in uneven pools of yellow and gray. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a building, old and tired, shadows stretched too long under flickering lights. I turned the knob, and it didn't move. I tried again more forcefully, and still it refused. My stomach knotted. I tugged harder, heart hammering, and then I heard it. The soft, definitive click of the lock engaging from inside. The doorknob didn't turn, and the door didn't budge. I pulled back, my mind racing. My pulse spiked as a whisper, soft, deliberate, almost coaxing, threaded through my thoughts. The air felt colder now, heavier, pressing into me, thick with anticipation. I took a cautious step back, flashlight sweeping the hallway, and that's when I noticed them. The shadows were no longer passive, stretching along the baseboards and corners. They were moving, inching closer, patient, deliberate. I could feel their attention, pressing into the back of my mind, a subtle, suffocating awareness that made my skin crawl. Stay calm, I muttered under my breath. The sound of my own voice was small against the oppressive silence. It's just a building, old wiring, drafts, shadows. But even as I said it, I knew my rational explanations were weak. This wasn't normal. Not the door, not the shadows, not the way the air had weight. Something else was here, patient, aware, deliberate. I backed away slowly, heart racing, flashlight sweeping in wide arcs. The shadows seemed to twist and curl in response, stretching subtly toward me. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but my feet felt like lead. The hallway seemed longer now, endless in its repetition. Each door I passed looked the same, identical, yet heavier somehow, oppressive. Room 213 loomed behind me. Door locked, impossible to open, and I could still feel its presence pressing through the walls, patient and aware. I turned the corner, flashlight beam trembling. The shadows followed, creeping closer with a subtle patience, curling at the edges, shifting slightly when I wasn't looking directly. My stomach churned. I felt eyes on me, though there was nothing visible, nothing that should have been able to see me. And yet, I could feel the attention, deliberate and cold. I tried the front desk door. Locked. Panic rose in my chest, a tight, relentless pressure. The building itself seemed to hold me, patient, deliberate, testing me. I realized then that it wasn't just room 213. The entire motel had shifted subtly in the night. The halls longer, the doors heavier, the shadows alive in ways that made no sense. I swallowed hard, throat dry, and forced my feet to move. A low creak echoed from behind me. My flashlight swung instinctively, catching the base of the walls. Shadows pooled there, curling upward, stretching slightly, patient and deliberate. My pulse thundered in my ears. I forced myself to focus, to breathe, to plan. There had to be a way out. There always is. I moved quickly toward the end of the hallway, checking each door. Room 214. Empty. Room 215. Empty. But every room I passed carried the same oppressive weight, the same subtle presence. I felt watched, aware, patient, deliberate. Every instinct screamed that I was being funneled, guided through some design I didn't understand. Then I saw it, the back stairwell, the emergency exit. Relief hit me, but it was tempered by a deep gnawing unease. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch toward the stairwell, curling like fingers, patient but insistent. I forced my feet to move faster, flashlight beam cutting across the walls, shadows twitching at the edges. The stairs were narrow, carpeted in the same faded pattern as the hallways. I descended quickly, hands sliding along the railing. Each step echoed faintly, absorbed strangely by the building. The shadows twisted along the walls, reaching toward me, stretching, patient and deliberate. I felt the air thicken, pressing into my chest, making it hard to breathe. Halfway down, I glanced behind me. The hallway above was empty, or at least I thought it was, but the shadows lingered at the edges of the stairwell, moving subtly, curling, patient. I forced my gaze forward, down the steps, try not to look back, try and keep moving. The door at the bottom of the stairs loomed, metal and unyielding, the emergency exit I had memorized from orientation. I reached the door, hard hammering, knuckles white on the handle. I pulled. Nothing. The lock had engaged, silently, impossibly. My stomach dropped. Panic threatened to overtake me. But I forced myself to breathe. There had to be another way. There's always another way. I scanned the stairwell, flashlight trembling, shadows stretching and curling along the walls, patient, deliberate. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, mingled with something faintly acrid, like old smoke. I pressed forward, checking the side doors, each one locked, impossibly secure. The building itself seemed aware of me, holding me in place, patient and deliberate, testing me. I heard a soft scrape above me. Instinctively, I swung the flashlight. Nothing. The stairs were empty. Yet the sound had come from the top. From the hall I had just left. My pulse spiked. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the tremor in my hands. This place, this building, was alive in some way, patient, deliberate, aware. I forced myself to descend the last flight of stairs. The door loomed metal and cold. I pulled on the handle again. It resisted for a long moment, then clicked open, swinging outward. Relief hit me like a wave. I stumbled outside, cool night air filling my lungs, chest heaving. The motel stood silent behind me, darkened windows reflecting faint moonlight. I didn't stop moving. I ran across the parking lot, flashlight swinging wildly until I reached my patrol car. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and leaned against the seat, trying to steady my breathing. The shadows of the building seemed to stretch toward me even from here, curling at the corners of the lot, patient, deliberate, lingering. The metallic smell clung faintly in the night air, carried on the breeze. I gagged slightly, mouth dry, stomach churning. The memory of the locked doors, the shifting shadows, the oppressive weight of the air, it all pressed on my mind, lingering, patient. I knew I'd never forget the sensation of that hallway, the presence in room 213, the way the motel itself had seemed to resist me. I started the car slowly, headlights cutting through the night. The building receded in the rear-view mirror, silent, dark, patient. But even as I drove away, I could feel in my mind a subtle pressure, a reminder. The motel watches, deliberate and aware, patient and waiting. And I knew deep down that it wouldn't let go. Not entirely. Every shadow, every locked door, every metallic tang of the air would haunt me long after I left. That night, I realized that some places aren't empty when they should be. They are patient, deliberate, and they remember. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. The way the shadows moved, the way the doors locked behind me, the subtle, persistent presence of something unseen, patient, deliberate, watching. And I know, in the back of my mind, that if I ever return, it will be waiting. I slid the badge into the reader and heard the soft beep. That meant I was officially on the clock. The factory loomed before me, enormous and silent, a skeleton of metal and concrete under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. It was late, far later than I'd ever worked before, and the emptiness of the space hit me immediately, thick and almost physical. I shook my shoulders, tried to loosen the tension creeping up my spine. Night shifts always felt like this at first. Unnatural, heavy, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Inside, the silence was absolute, not the comfortable silence of a building at rest, but a hollow, waiting kind of quiet. The overhead lights hummed faintly, a monotone drone that filled the vast interior. Conveyor belts stretched into darkness, idle but somehow vibrating with the memory of movement. Faint shadows of activity imprinted in the steel. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow circle. Dust motes swirled lazily in the air, glinting like tiny stars in the pale light. I took my first steps onto the factory floor, boots clicking against the concrete. The machinery loomed on either side, massive presses and welders, silent but somehow alive, humming faintly, vibrating to the floor as though the building remembered the work of the day. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was something else, low and insistent, like the factory was breathing slowly, patient, deliberate. My chest tightened. I walked past the first row of machines, scanning carefully. Everything looked normal. Conveyor belts still, forklifts parked neatly, safety chains in place. And yet, the hum persisted. Low, almost imperceptible, but growing subtly as I moved further in. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied, but the brief darkness made my stomach knot. I swallowed hard. I had worked plenty of night shifts, seen empty warehouses, factories, and office buildings at odd hours. This wasn't that. This was wrong. I turned a corner and froze. A press in the middle of the floor, the biggest one, was running. I could see the pistons moving, the belt spinning slightly, though the power was off. No lights, no electricity flowing, just movement. My pulse quickened. I thought about calling in, telling dispatch there was some kind of malfunction, but something stopped me. My gut twisted. A cold, heavy warning that this wasn't a technical glitch. It was deliberate, patient. I approached slowly, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The closer I got, the more I realized the hum wasn't coming from the machinery. It was coming from the building itself, vibrating through the floor, through the walls, threading into my bones. I stopped mid-step, heart hammering, and took a deep breath. It had to be my imagination. It had to be. And then I heard it, a faint metallic scraping from the far end of the floor. My flashlight beam darted across the space, landing on nothing. Just empty machines, idle and silent. My stomach churned. The sound came again, soft, deliberate, like nails dragging across steel. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was some loose panel or a settling piece of equipment. But my rational explanations felt brittle, inadequate. I moved toward the sound, keeping the beam sweeping the floor. Every shadow seemed to twitch, stretching slightly at the edges, moving when I wasn't looking directly. The hum of the factory grew louder, resonating in my chest, syncing with my pulse. I took a cautious step onto a raised platform, flashlight illuminating the catwalk and the drop below. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I couldn't stop. My curiosity, or perhaps some foolish courage, pushed me forward. Then I saw it, a forklift, one I knew had been parked near the loading dock, now slightly tilted, as if someone had nudged it, but the floor around it was clean. No tire marks, no footprints, nothing, and yet it had moved, slowly, impossibly, deliberately. My hand shook. My flashlight beam swept the area again, catching the edge of shadow that didn't belong, stretched long and thin along the wall. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, it had shifted. A subtle change, but unmistakable. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Machines settled. Shadows shift. My eyes played tricks. It had to be that. I forced myself to move further down the aisle, keeping the flashlight beam low, sweeping over the belts and presses. The hum was louder here, insistent, vibrating in a way that made my teeth ache. I tried to focus on my patrol route, to check the emergency exits, the fire extinguishers, the locked doors. Everything routine, everything familiar, but nothing was familiar. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, curling around my senses. Shadows clung to corners, pooling unnaturally, stretching subtly when I wasn't looking directly at them. The metallic smell hit faintly, not unpleasant, just present, curling the back of my throat. My pulse quickened, chest tight. Something was here. Something patient, deliberate, aware. A sudden movement caught my eye. A conveyor belt shifted slightly, just a few inches, though the power was still off. I froze, flashlight beam fixed on the machinery. It didn't seem mechanical. There was no rhythm, no pattern, just slow, impossible movement. My stomach twisted. I could feel the presence before I saw it, pressing into the edges of my mind, patient, deliberate. I swallowed hard and tried to keep moving, telling myself to finish the patrol. The loading dock doors were next. I passed rows of presses, racks of metal, work tables. Every shadow seemed alive, curling slightly, inching closer when I wasn't looking. I could hear the faint hum in my chest, resonating to the concrete, through the steel beams, threading into my thoughts. Then a sudden clang echoed across the floor, making me jump. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The machine was still. Empty aisle. Shadows stretched along the walls. I took a step forward, but the clang came again. Closer this time, deliberate. My heart raced, pulse hammering in my ears. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. Just the building, I whispered under my breath. Old steel, expanding, contracting, nothing more. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. The factory wasn't behaving like a building. It was alive in a way I couldn't understand. Patient, deliberate, aware. I moved toward the exit. Flashlight beam cutting across the empty aisles. The shadows twisted slightly at the corners, curling and stretching patient. The metallic hum pressed into me, thick and insistent. My stomach churned, every nerve on edge. I could feel something unseen moving with me, just beyond perception, deliberate, patient. I reached the back exit doors. Relief hit briefly, but it was tempered by the hum, the shadows, the shifting machinery. I pushed the doors open and stepped outside. Night air filling my lungs, chest heaving. The factory loomed behind me, dark, silent, but patient, waiting. I could feel it in my bones, that subtle awareness, deliberate and deliberate. I leaned against my patrol car, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The hum lingered faintly in my mind, the metallic smell faint in the air. I knew, even now, that the building would follow me in memory, patient, deliberate, a presence that didn't belong to the ordinary world. And as I started the car and drove into the night, I realized that this night shift, like all the others, was only the beginning. The factory watched, and it would not forget. I thought the first night had been strange, that the hum, the shifting machines, and the impossible movements of the equipment were all I would ever contend with. But as I started the second patrol, the building's weight settled on me more heavily, like a fist pressing against my chest. The factory was quiet, silent in ways I couldn't describe, yet it felt full of memory, of movement, of presence. The first thing I noticed was the voices, soft, almost imperceptible, drifting along the far aisle where the presses and assembly lines had long been idle. I froze, flashlight beams sweeping the floor, the machines, the corners, but nothing moved. No one should have been there. The factory had been closed for years. And yet, there was a rhythm to the voices, a cadence like workers speaking to each other, shouting across the belts, laughing faintly. I shook my head, telling myself it was the air ducts, wind passing through cracks, the old building settling. But the voices weren't mechanical, and they weren't random. They carried purpose, subtle and deliberate. I strained to listen, recognizing no words, just syllables, the rise and fall conversation. My stomach twisted, my pulse quickened. As I moved further in, I began to notice the shadows. At first, I thought it was my imagination, low beams from my flashlight stretching along the machinery, reflections in steel panels. But then, a shadow shifted in a way that didn't match anything in the room. I froze, heart hammering. The shadow mimicked my movements. Slow at first, deliberate, curling like smoke around corners, rising from the floorboards. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to walk, flashlight held high, every step careful. With each movement, the shadows followed. When I raised my hand, the shadow raised its own, just slightly behind, almost delayed, almost perfect. I spun to see who or what it could be, but the aisle was empty. Nothing but the press, the conveyors, the idle machines. The voices came again, louder this time, closer. I could swear they were murmuring right behind me, whispering indistinct words I couldn't comprehend. I turned sharply, scanning the floor with the flashlight. Empty, but the sound lingered in the air, curling around me, pressing against my senses. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, threading into my nostrils, curling at the back of my throat. I walked cautiously past the presses. Each step seemed to echo too loudly, swallowed by the vastness of the factory. And yet, each echo had a twin, faint and subtle, almost a reply. The voices whispered over the echoes, soft, deliberate, patient. I realized that the factory remembered that each step, each sound I made, was being mirrored in a way that shouldn't be possible. A shadow moved along the floor near a conveyor belt. It twisted, curling upward like a snake of darkness, stretching slightly as if testing boundaries. I held my flashlight steady, trying to focus, trying to convince myself it was just a play of light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadow was aware, deliberate, moving in response to me, reacting to me. My pulse thudded painfully. I walked faster, tried to reach the main office where I could check cameras or at least feel some sense of control. The shadows followed, patient, deliberate, curling along the edges of machinery, stretching along the walls. I could hear faint murmurs behind me, low, unintelligible, almost conversational, but impossible. I quickened my pace. The factory hummed beneath me, not the machinery, not electricity, but a living hum threading to the floorboards, the walls, the ceiling, vibrating in rhythm with my heartbeat. A faint clatter echoed from the far side of the room. My flashlight darted to the source. A chair, one I hadn't noticed before, was now tilted, rocking slightly. No one was there. The air felt colder, heavier, pressing into me. I swallowed hard, throat dry. The voices rose briefly, just at the edge of comprehension, almost teasing. I forced myself to take another step, flashlight beam cutting across the shadows that moved just beyond logic, curling, rising, following, patient. I could see the outline of another shadow near the mezzanine stairs. It mimicked me perfectly as I lifted my hand. I froze. The shadow tilted its head, delayed, but deliberate. I spun. The aisle was empty. Nothing but the echoing voices, the metallic hum, and the oppressive weight of the air. I swallowed again, trying to calm the trembling in my hands, my legs. I moved toward the office, every sense straining. The shadows shifted subtly as I passed machines, stretching along rails, pooling at corners. The voices murmured, whispering in tones that mimicked laughter, conversation, arguments, but impossible, faint, distant yet near. The room seemed alive, aware, deliberate. I could feel its patience pressing on me, pressing into me, threading into my thoughts. When I reached the office, I paused, leaning against the metal railing outside the door. My breath came in quick bursts. The shadows below mimicked my movements again, patient, deliberate. I forced myself to look at the monitors, to focus on something tangible. The screens flickered, showing nothing but static and the occasional faint outline of the factory floor. And yet, even on the monitors, I could swear I saw figures where no one could exist, shadows moving independently, patient. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight on the floor as I retreated from the office. The voices followed, rising slightly, layered, overlapping, impossible to locate. The shadows twisted along the walls, along the machines, stretching toward me in subtle, impossible arcs. My pulse raced. Every step I took felt heavy, weighted by the awareness pressing in from every side. The air was colder now, icy tendrils brushing my skin, curling around my spine. The metallic tang was stronger, curling into my nostrils, mingling with the scent of dust and machinery. I shivered violently, forcing my feet to move toward the exit. But the shadows and whispers seemed to guide me in a way I didn't control, patient, deliberate, aware. I reached the main floor and paused. The voices rose, faint laughter threading through murmurs, shifting, teasing. Shadows coiled along the baseboards and corners, moving just beyond reception, curling upward, following, patient. I felt my pulse hammering, my stomach twisting. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, but my feet felt weighted, reluctant, compelled to witness. I moved toward the exit doors slowly, flashlight cutting a narrow path. Each shadow mirrored me. Each whisper echoed my movements. I could feel the building remembering me, following me, deliberate in its patience. My chest tightened. I realized then that the factory wasn't empty. It had never been empty. The voices of workers long gone threaded through the air, and the shadows mirrored the living in ways that made my mind reel. When I finally stepped through the doors, the night air hit me like a wave. Cold, damp, real. I gasped, breath ragged, stomach churning, heart pounding. Behind me, the factory loomed silent, dark, patient. But I knew the voices were still there, echoes of long-dead workers, murmuring in rhythm with the shadows, deliberate, aware, watching. I leaned against my patrol car, trying to steady my breathing. But even in the parking lot, I could feel it. The hum, the subtle pressure of awareness, the patient presence of something that remembered. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to bone, that the factory would not let me leave my first night undisturbed. It would follow me in memory, patient, deliberate, aware. Even as I drove away, I could hear the faint murmur, the subtle echoes threading through my thoughts. Shadows and voices, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next night shift to return. I had told myself I would keep calm, that I would stay rational, that the first strange night and the echoes of long-dead workers were isolated incidents. But as I stepped onto the factory floor for my third patrol, I realized how wrong I had been. The air felt thicker, heavier, and colder, pressing into my chest in a way that made each breath a labor. My flashlight beam cut narrow circles into the darkness, but the shadows seemed to shift at the edges, curling, stretching, patient, and deliberate. The hum of the building was different tonight, lower, vibrating through the steel beams and concrete, threading into my bones. I moved toward the central aisle, where the conveyor belts stretched like veins across the floor, idle during the day, but alive in memory. Or at least, that's what I had assumed. The first sign that something had changed was subtle. A small box, once perfectly still, now rocked gently on the conveyor belt. I froze, heartbeat spiking. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I watched it. Then it shifted, sliding slowly along the belt, though no motor hummed beneath it. I swallowed hard, forcing my mind to grasp at rational explanations. Vibration, air currents, an uneven floor. But none of it fit. The box moved with intention, deliberate, precise, threading along the belt as if guided by something unseen. I took a cautious step forward. The box stopped, almost waiting for me. I shook my head. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. "It's nothing. It's just the building, old wire and gravity." But my voice sounded hollow in the vast, empty space, swallowed by the low hum threading through the floor. As I walked along the edge of the conveyor, more objects began to shift. A stack of crates, a toolbox, a lone helmet. They moved in slow, deliberate arcs, as though carried by invisible hands. My pulse pounded. The shadows along the walls stretched and twisted in time with the objects, almost mimicking their motion. Each step I took was mirrored subtly, patiently, deliberately, by darkness that had no right to exist. I forced myself to move faster, scanning the belts and the floor with the flashlight. The metallic tang of the air was stronger tonight, curling in the back of my throat, pressing into my senses. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, that something unseen was observing, calculating, waiting. The boxes and crates shifted more aggressively now, bumping against each other, rolling slightly as if testing my reactions. Then the first real scare came. A crate slid abruptly down the belt, striking the floor with a dull thud. My flashlight jerked as I swung it toward the source. Nothing, just the empty aisle, the humming steel, and the shadows curling along the walls. But the sense of being watched intensified, pressing on my chest, threading into my thoughts. I swallowed hard and kept moving, flashlight sweeping. The next movement was faster. A small toolbox slid down the conveyor toward me at a speed that was impossible for an inert object. I jumped back instinctively, barely avoiding the strike. My pulse raced. My hands shook. I knew this was a mechanical failure. The air was thick with intent, deliberate, patient, aware. The building itself, or something inhabiting it, was alive in a way I couldn't comprehend. I turned to retreat, moving back along the walkway, flashlight slicing through the darkness. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. A shadow detached from the wall, twisting, coiling, moving with subtle intention. It wasn't solid, not quite, but it mirrored me perfectly, delayed by a fraction of a second, patient, deliberate. My stomach churned. The objects on the belts continued to move, nudging forward, bumping slightly as if hurting me, corralling me toward some destination I didn't want to reach. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to breathe. I scanned the aisles, searching for a safe path, any exit, anything familiar. The belt shifted, crates rolling, boxes sliding in ways that defied physics. I could hear the faint scrape of metal on metal, the subtle thrum of the building beneath my feet. Every step I took seemed to echo, and the shadows responded, stretching, curling, patient. Then I heard a low, deliberate scraping sound from behind me, closer than it should be, faster than I expected. I spun, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The aisle was empty. The belts were still moving, the crates sliding, but no source was visible. The sound came again, following me, deliberate, patient, impossibly close. My stomach lurched. I began to run, boots pounding against the concrete, flashlight beam bouncing erratically. The conveyor belts reacted. Boxes, crates, tools, all began moving faster, sliding down toward me, bumping against my legs. I stumbled, barely catching myself, heartbeat hammering in my ears. The shadows followed, stretching along the walls and across the belts, curling at the edges like fingers reaching for me. The metallic tang in the air intensified, curling into my nostrils, pressing against my senses. I ducked behind a row of idle machines, flashlight beam shaking. The crate slowed, almost waiting, patient. The shadow along the wall mirrored my movement, coiling slowly, deliberately, aware. My breath came in short bursts. I tried to think, to reason, but every instinct screamed that reason had no place here. I was prey in a space that remembered, that responded, that waited. I edged along the machines, trying to avoid the moving belts, but the crates began shifting again, nudging me toward the main aisle. The shadow followed, patient, deliberate, curling in ways that made no sense. I could hear the scraping behind me, the thud of objects colliding, the faint hum threading through the steel floor, vibrating in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat. A sudden movement caught my eye. A toolbox slid off the belt, landing inches from my foot. I jumped back instinctively. The belt seemed to pulse, moving in subtle undulations as if alive. Another crate slid forward, followed by a helmet. They weren't just moving. They were chasing, hurting, aware. My stomach churned. I forced myself to move faster, running now along the walkway, flashlight bouncing wildly. The shadows stretched across the floor, rising slightly from the edges, curling toward me. I could feel the pressure of them, patient, deliberate, aware. Every step I took seemed anticipated, every movement mirrored. I ducked around a corner, gasping, heart hammering, but the sound followed, the scraping, the hum, the subtle thrum of a building that knew me, that remembered me. I could see the exit doors at the far end, just beyond the final belt. Relief surged, but it was tempered by the movement behind me. Crates shifted, tools slid, boxes bumped into each other, all heading in my direction, patient, deliberate. The shadows followed, curling and stretching along walls and machines. The metallic tang was thick now, pressing in my lungs, biting my throat. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to carry me faster. I reached the doors and pulled on the handle. Locked. My stomach sank. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping frantically. The conveyor belts had moved all the objects toward me, now lined up as if forming a barrier. The shadows pressing at the edges, patient, deliberate, aware, panic clawed at my chest. I hammered on the door, trying to force it open, the metallic tang thick in the air, pressing against my senses. And then a sudden silence. The belt stopped. The crates froze. The shadows hung still, curling along the walls, patient, deliberate. I gasped, heart racing, leaning against the door, sweat running down my neck. I didn't understand what just happened, why it stopped, why I was allowed this moment. But I knew it wasn't safe. Not yet. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the belts. Every object remained frozen, every shadow still. The hum of the building lingered faintly, threading through the floor, through the walls, patient. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I had survived for now, but the awareness, the deliberate, patient intelligence behind the movement, it lingered in my mind, threading into my thoughts, following me, even as I finally managed to find another exit and step into the cold night air. The factory loomed behind me, dark, silent, patient. I knew it remembered, that it watched, that it waited for the next ship, the next patrol. And I knew, deep down, that the conveyor belts, the shadows, the objects. They weren't done with me. Not yet. The night started like all the others, cold, heavy, and unsettling. But the second I stepped through the main entrance of the factory, I knew something had changed. The air was thick, almost suffocating. A gray haze curling along the beams and across the floor. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the fog, but the light scattered, reflecting off swirling particles, distorting everything it touched. I coughed, hand over my mouth, but the air was dry and acrid, carrying a faint metallic tang that clawed at my throat. The hum of the building had grown deeper, resonant, vibrating beneath my feet and threading into my chest. It was patient, deliberate, aware, like the factory itself was awake and waiting. Every instinct screamed that I should leave, that I should abandon patrol and run. But something, a mixture of duty and stubborn curiosity, kept me moving forward. I reached the central aisle, where the conveyor belt stretched endlessly into the gray haze. Objects shifted as usual, slow and deliberate, but the smoke made it hard to see them clearly. Shapes floated just out of reach of the flashlight, bending and stretching in ways that made my stomach twist. I realized with a jolt that my own reflection was fractured in every piece of metal or glass I passed. Panels that had once been dull now reflected distorted images of me, elongated, twisted, impossible. I paused, chest tight, flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure in the reflection lifted its hand slightly after I did, not immediately, but delayed by a fraction of a second. My stomach churned. Shadows curled around the edges of the haze, stretching toward me, patient, deliberate, aware. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to move. Each step felt heavy, weighted with dread. As I moved down the aisle, the smoke thickened, curling around machinery and floor grates, twisting into shapes that reminded me of faces, then hands, then nothing at all. I blinked and the shapes shifted, impossible, deliberate. The conveyor belts groaned softly, though no power was running, and I could hear the faint scraping of metal against metal, objects nudging forward as if herded by unseen hands. My pulse quickened, chest pounding in rhythm with the subtle thrum of the building beneath me. I turned a corner, hoping to find some sense of orientation, but the smoke warped the aisle, making the room seem longer, the shadows darker, the reflections more sinister. I glanced at a polished steel panel and froze. My own face stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. Eyes wider than they should be, mouth twisted into an almost smile I hadn't made. I blinked, heart hammering, and the reflection twisted again, fading into the gray haze. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. I had to focus. I had to survive. The floor beneath me creaked as I stepped onto a raised platform. The shadows twisted along the rails, curling and stretching with life of their own, patient, deliberate. I could hear faint murmurs, whispers carried on the smoke, overlapping and unintelligible, teasing, urging me to move faster or maybe slower. I couldn't tell. The air pressed into my lungs, heavy and sharp, and I forced myself to take shallow, controlled breaths. A sudden movement to my left made me spin. A crate slid slowly down a conveyor, barely visible through the haze. Then another, and another, nudging toward me with deliberate intent. My flashlight beam darted across the belts, illuminating more objects that shouldn't have moved, each following an invisible path, aware, patient. I stumbled back, hand gripping the railing, chest hammering. The shadows seemed to respond to my panic, stretching farther along the walls, coiling around machinery, patient. I moved cautiously, keeping my light low, scanning for exits, for something solid, something real. The reflections continued to shift and distort, and every time I looked into a panel, a sheet of metal or a cracked window, I saw myself just slightly wrong. Limbs longer than they should be, shadows darker, face twisted, patient, deliberate. I forced my eyes away, forcing my mind to focus on the patrol route, on the exit doors at the far end. The smoke grew thicker still, curling into the walkway, masking the floor, hiding the conveyor belts and objects in ghostly veils. I stumbled over a toolbox, heart leaping, and looked up to find the shadow of myself stretched impossibly tall along the wall. It moved deliberately, following me, patient, waiting. I could feel it pressing against my awareness, threading into my thoughts, insistent, relentless. I kept moving, hands trembling, flashlight beam bouncing erratically across distorted reflections and curling smoke. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, burning at my nostrils, making my throat ache. I coughed violently, forcing myself to keep walking, each step echoing in the hollow space, swallowed immediately by the hum of the building. A sudden flicker caught my eye. A mirror leaned against a stack of crates. I froze. In its reflection, the aisle appeared longer, twisting impossibly into darkness. My own figure moved in the mirror as I did, but delayed, and the delay seemed to be deliberate. It wasn't just a reflection. It was aware. I swallowed hard, forcing my shaking hands to move the flashlight. Shadows shifted in the haze around me, curling toward the mirrored image, pressing into the edges of reality. The whispers returned, louder, almost impatient now. I could hear the soft scrape of metal against metal, objects nudging along the belts, and the faint hum seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. Panic clawed at my chest. I forced myself to run, stumbling over the uneven floor, weaving through the smoke and shadows. Every step felt anticipated, mirrored by the haze, by the reflections, by the deliberate stretching of darkness along walls and machinery. I reached the far end of the factory and spotted the emergency exit. Relief surged, but it was tempered instantly by the distortion in the air. The smoke thickened, curling around the door, turning into an impossible portal, shifting subtly, as if the building itself were warping the space. Shadows coiled at the edges, patient, deliberate, aware. My pulse hammered painfully. I shoved against the door, fists raw, heart racing, and it yielded just enough for me to slip through. The night air hit me in a wave, cold and real. I gasped, lungs burning, chest heaving. The fog receded behind me, and the factory loomed silently, dark, patient. I could feel its awareness lingering, threading into my thoughts, deliberate, waiting. The metallic tang still clung faintly to my senses, a reminder that the building hadn't released me entirely. I stumbled back to my patrol car, hands shaking, chest pounding, sweat running down my neck. The echoes of the factory followed me in memory. The shifting objects, the shadows, the distorted reflections, patient and deliberate. I realized, even as I drove into the cold night, that the building would continue to watch, to remember, and that I had narrowly escaped its influence this time. But I knew it wouldn't let me go for long. The smoke, the mirrors, the deliberate awareness of the factory, they would be waiting, and when I returned, patient and deliberate, the building would still remember, still watch, still respond to every step I took. The radio crackled just as I was about to settle into the first hour of my patrol. I thought it was just static at first, usual interference out here. But then a voice cut through, low, urgent, and almost pleading. Emergency! Help! Please! It was broken, fragmented, like someone was speaking through layers of static and distance. I adjusted the dial, trying to catch it clearly, but every time I thought I had it, the signal would fade, replaced by that cold, empty static that pressed against your ears and rattled your bones. The location they gave made my stomach tighten. It was an old industrial site, long abandoned, fenced off and marked for demolition. Most of the buildings had been gutted years ago. My hand tightened around the steering wheel as I thought about the stories, vagrants, rumors of trespassers, strange lights at night. But I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. And yet, the tone in that voice wasn't something I could explain away. It wasn't panic like a prank. It was deliberate, strained, desperate. I radioed back, asking for clarification, repeating the coordinates. Only static answered me. The voice was gone. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that makes your teeth clench and your stomach twist. I took a deep breath and started the engine. The night air pressed in from the cracked window, heavy with damp and the faint smell of decay. Somewhere ahead, that abandoned site waited, silent, patient. By the time I reached the perimeter, the moon had slipped behind clouds, leaving the lot drenched in a dim gray light. The old fence loomed like a skeletal grin, rusted, twisted. The buildings were black shadows, hulks of concrete and metal, their windows empty eyes staring at me. I parked at the edge and grabbed my flashlight, heart thudding. Every instinct told me to stay back, to call for backup, but the voice, that desperate, pleading tone, it anchored me. Someone or something was there and I had to find out. I moved toward the nearest building, the gravel crunching under my boots echoing across the empty yard. Each step felt amplified in the silence. My flashlight beam cut swaths through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, broken glass, and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. The air was heavy with dust, and a faint metallic tang clung to my nose. I forced myself to breathe steadily, telling myself this was an empty sight, nothing more. Inside the building, the darkness swallowed me. My flashlight bounced across the walls, illuminating the debris, old machinery, and the hollowed-out offices. The air was damp, stale, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible scent of smoke or burnt metal. I moved cautiously, each footstep measured, my ears straining for anything that could indicate life or danger. Then I heard it, a faint scraping, distant but deliberate. It came from the far side of the main hall, somewhere beyond the shadows. My pulse spiked. I told myself it was loose metal, falling pipes, or rats, but the rhythm was deliberate, almost like someone pacing. I froze, listening, the sound pausing when I did. The hair on my arms prickled. The voice over the radio returned to my mind, whispering through the static. "Help, please." I followed the sound, flashlight beam cutting narrow slices through the blackness. Broken furniture, scattered papers, shadows stretching and twisting at the edges of perception. I reached what had once been the reception area. The floor was littered with debris, papers, shards of glass, a rusted chair tipped over. But there was nothing alive, nothing that should have made the noise. And yet, my instinct screamed that I was being watched. Patiently, deliberately, a cold draft brushed past me, carrying that faint metallic tang. I spun, flashlight sweeping the room. But there was nothing, just shadows that clung to corners, stretching impossibly along the walls, patient, deliberate. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move forward. The voice, it hadn't returned, but I could feel it in the building, threading through the air, pressing into the corners and empty spaces. As I moved deeper, I saw it, a flicker of movement near the stairwell leading to the upper floors. My heart leapt. The beam caught a shadow, twisting just beyond the reach of the light, moving with intention. I took a cautious step forward. The shadow froze. I stopped. My pulse pounded. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my lungs, wrapping around my chest. The sound of the radio again, static at first, then that broken voice, faint and distorted. "Here, need." It cut out before words completed, leaving only static and that sense of urgent, impossible presence. I forced myself to breathe, trying to steady the shaking in my hands. Every rational thought told me there was no one here, that this place had been abandoned for years, and yet every instinct screamed otherwise. I ascended the stairwell slowly, the steps groaning beneath my weight. The upper floor was darker, narrower, the remnant of offices and storage rooms stretching in all directions. Shadows clung to corners, moving slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. My flashlight trembled as I scanned the room, catching glimpses of shapes that didn't make sense. Furniture angled wrong, reflections in broken glass that didn't match the room, a fleeting figure just beyond reach. Then the scraping returned, closer, deliberate. I spun toward it, but nothing was there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize. Wind through broken windows, loose metal, echoes. But the rhythm, the awareness behind it, the deliberate pauses, none of it made sense. It felt almost intelligent, patient, observing. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to run, to leave this place immediately. But the voice, the desperate, fragmented plea over the radio, anchored me in place. Someone or something needed help. I moved down the corridor, flashlight beam cutting through thick shadows. Each step echoed, swallowed immediately by the vast emptiness. I could feel the building responding, objects shifting slightly as I passed, shadows coiling along walls and ceilings, deliberate, patient. I glanced into a broken office and froze. My own reflection stared back at me from a cracked window, but wrong. Elongated limbs, a face twisted slightly, patient. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the hollow room and the faint metallic tang in the air. The far end of the hall opened into what had once been a storage area. Dust motes floated in the flashlight beam. I saw the faint outline of someone, or something, moving just beyond the reach of light. My stomach tightened. The figure didn't step forward. It didn't retreat. It simply lingered, patient, deliberate, aware. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a cautious step closer. Then a sound, a thud, then a scrape, echoed from behind me. I spun. The corridor was empty, but the air felt heavier, pressing against me, threading into my senses. The voice over the radio whispered in my memory, "Emergency help!" I realized then that it wasn't coming from a person. Not really. It was coming from the building itself, from the shadows and silence. Deliberate, patient, aware. Panic clawed at my chest. I forced myself to focus, to remember training, to stay rational. I scanned the room, every corner, every shadow. The shapes seemed to shift subtly with my movements, curling along walls, stretching impossibly patient. I could feel the awareness pressing into me, threading into my thoughts, deliberate and unrelenting. I took a step backward, tripping slightly over debris in the shadow, or whatever it was, mirrored me, delayed just enough to make my heart hammer. I stumbled to the stairs, fumbling with the railing, pulling myself down step by step. The scraping followed, deliberate, patient, threading behind me through the halls. My pulse raced, chest tight, legs trembling. I finally reached the main floor. The night air rushed in through broken windows, carrying the smell of rust, dust, and faint smoke. I bolted for the exit, stumbling over broken concrete and debris. Behind me, the building seemed to shift, dark shapes curling at the corners, patient, deliberate. The metallic tang clung to the air as if reluctant to let me leave. I reached my car, hands shaking, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could still feel the presence, patient, deliberate, threading into memory. I fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and drove away, glancing back once at the dark hulks of the abandoned site. Silent now, but watching, waiting. Even as I sped down the empty road, the memory of that voice lingered, desperate, fractured, pleading. And I knew, with a certainty that gnawed at my stomach, that the building remembered. Patient, deliberate, aware, and it wasn't done with me. The road had been empty for miles, black asphalt cutting through the dark like a knife. My headlights barely reached beyond the bends, and the radio was dead silent. Then, through the static, a tip had come in, an unregistered structure spotted by a passerby. Off the grid, the kind of place that didn't exist on any map. My patrol instincts told me to be cautious, but curiosity, or maybe the stubborn part of me that always wanted answers, drove me forward. I didn't see it at first. One moment, the field stretched endlessly. The next, a dark shape rose against the horizon. A house, standing alone, like it had always belonged there, and like it had been waiting. Its silhouette was jagged, uneven, the roof line collapsing in odd angles, windows uneven and wide, staring. I slowed to a stop, headlights illuminating the gravel driveway that seemed to appear from nowhere. I glanced down at the GPS. Nothing. The coordinates placed me in the middle of a field. No roads, no structure, just nothing. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, heart thudding. The air was thick and still, carrying a faint smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach twist. I approached the house cautiously, gravel crunching under my boots. The closer I got, the more I realized the windows weren't just empty. They seemed alive. Dark shapes flickered behind the glass, and the faintest gleam of light suggested movement. But no one was there. Not a soul. I squinted. The reflection of my flashlight shifted strangely across the panes, bending the image of myself in ways that didn't make sense. I reached the porch, its wooden boards groaning beneath my weight, paint peeled in long strips, curling like dead skin. A vine crept along the frame, twisting unnaturally, clinging to corners as if it had a life of its own. I hesitated at the threshold. The air inside smelled stale, yet oddly warm. I swallowed, forcing my hand to push the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was darker than I expected. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching along walls, curling over furniture. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight, swirling like tiny galaxies. The floor creaked underfoot, each step magnified in the silence. I moved slowly, senses sharp. Something about the air felt wrong, like the house was aware of me, patient, deliberate. The windows followed me. Every time I moved, the shadows within shifted, twisting and bending as if mimicking my movements. I caught glimpses of figures in the corners of my eyes. Just glimpses, blurred and impossible. Every time I spun toward them, there was nothing but the sense of being watched press into my chest. My pulse quickened, chest tight, and I forced myself to breathe. I reached the living room. Furniture was stacked oddly, chairs leaning against walls at impossible angles, a sofa pushed halfway into a wall. The floorboard seemed to pulse slightly beneath my feet, or maybe that was just the tension warping my perception. I moved toward a window. My reflection stared back, pale and distorted. The eyes weren't quite right, shadows lingering beneath them that weren't mine. I jerked back, heart hammering. A soft creak came from upstairs. I froze, listening. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone stepping lightly across old wood. I told myself it was probably the wind or the house settling, but the air felt thicker, more insistent. I forced my legs to move toward the staircase, flashlight beam darting across walls lined with peeling wallpaper and water stains. The closer I got, the more I felt the presence in the house, pressing, patient, deliberate, aware. Halfway up, I saw it. A shadow detached itself in the corner of the landing, stretching across the hallway. It was tall, thin, humanoid in shape, but elongated, disproportionate, moving with a grace that didn't belong to anything human. I stumbled back, gripping the railing, heart thundering. The shadow paused, just at the edge of the light, patient. I could feel its attention threading into my mind, deliberate, unrelenting. I forced myself to move past it, one trembling step at a time. Upstairs, the hallway stretched impossibly long, narrowing in places, bending at odd angles. Doors lined the corridor, some hanging open, others closed tight. Each door seemed to breathe slightly, exhaling shadows and cold air. I shined my flashlight into one. A figure, or maybe just a trick of the light, stood just beyond the threshold. It didn't move, but the air around it pressed in, heavy, suffocating. I blinked and it was gone. The whispers began. Faint at first, unintelligible, layered beneath the hum of the house. Words I couldn't understand, yet carried with a tone of desperation, of warning. I stopped, hand trembling on the flashlight. The windows along the hallway shifted subtly. The reflections of my own figure danced in impossible angles, limbs bending where they shouldn't. Shadows twisted along the walls, curling like smoke, patient, deliberate. I continued slowly, each step measured, scanning the rooms as I passed. One door opened onto what had once been a bedroom. The bed was still made, sheets folded neatly, yet the air was thick with a metallic tang of something long dead. I approached the window, and my reflection twisted again, eyes wider than they should be, mouth slightly open in a silent scream. I turned away quickly, forcing myself to move forward. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. The light from my flashlight didn't reach it fully, but I could feel the air pressing against me. The whispers were louder here, insistent, threading into my thoughts. I reached out to the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had absorbed the chill of the house itself. I pulled it open slowly. The room inside was empty, yet it felt alive. Shadows shifted across the walls, curling and stretching in ways that didn't obey logic. The air carried a faint, metallic tang and a whisper of heat, like something had been breathing here recently. I could feel the presence, patient and deliberate, aware, my stomach twisted, chest tight, heart hammering. The windows, they weren't just glass. They were eyes alive, reflecting my fear, stretching reality slightly with every glance. I stumbled backward, flashlight beam shaking. The house seemed to respond, corridors twisting subtly, shadows stretching to fill every corner. I realized with a jolt that leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking back the way I came. The rooms had rearranged themselves, subtly, impossibly. The walls narrowed, then widened. Doorways shifted at angles that made no sense. The presence of the house pressed into me. Patient, deliberate, aware, I ran. Each step echoed to the living room. bouncing off the walls, swallowed immediately by silence. The windows glimmered like dark mirrors, each reflection stretching and twisting my form, making me stagger. Shadows leapt from corners, curling toward me, patient and deliberate. My chest burned, lungs gasping for air. Finally, the front door appeared ahead, warped slightly in shape, leaning into the house's influence. I threw myself forward. Hands fumbled with the handle, and it gave way. The night air slammed against me, sharp and real. I fell onto the grass, coughing, heart hammering. The house loomed silently behind me, dark, patient, aware, windows flickering as if alive. I stumbled back to my patrol car, hands shaking, flashlight beam bouncing across the gravel. Even from the road, I could feel the house watching, deliberate, threading into my thoughts. The metallic tang clung faintly to the air, a reminder that it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Even now, hours later, I can't shake the feeling. Patient, deliberate, aware, waiting, watching. And I know, if I return, it will still remember.